Chapter 1. The Perfect Awakening. The first sensation was cold, not the gentle coolness of a morning breeze, but the sterile, bone-deep cold of a laboratory, where life and death were mere variables in an equation. Consciousness returned slowly, like oil seeping through cracked stone, bringing with it an awareness that should not have existed. I am. I think. Therefore I am. The thought emerged unbidden, philosophical yet instinctive, as violet eyes opened for the first time in a chamber deep within the demon world of Urum. The awakening was not gentle. Memory crashed over the newly conscious mind like a tide of molten metal, 10,000 years of history compressed into fragments of experience that belonged to another, yet felt undeniably his own. The drop site massacre, the screaming of metal against metal, the weight of the silver blade of Lair in hands that were his, but not his. Ferrus Manus, brother, friend, rival, falling beneath that accursed sword while something else wore his face, something that whispered promises of perfection and delivered only corruption. No. The word escaped perfect lips as the figure in the containment tank pressed pale hands against the reinforced glass. The voice was melodious, crafted by gene science to inspire loyalty and command respect, but it carried an edge of revulsion that would have surprised its creator. No, that is not how it happened. That is not who I am. But the memories persisted, a torrent of experiences, both beautiful and vile. The construction of great works of art that sang with mathematical perfection, the gradual slide into decadence that felt like silk wrapped around a razor, the whispers of a sword that promised transcendence but delivered damnation, and through it all, the growing awareness that something was fundamentally wrong, that the being wearing his face had become an abomination. The tank's occupant straightened to his full height, and even naked and newly awakened, he cut an imposing figure. 7 feet of perfectly sculpted physiology, every muscle and bone crafted according to the Emperor's original design. White hair fell in waves around features that could have been carved from the finest marble, save for the intelligence that burned in those violet eyes. This was what Fulgrim had been before the corruption, before the demon, before 10 millennia of degradation. Fabius Bile's masterpiece, the perfect clone of a Primarch. Specimen 018 shows signs of consciousness, came a crackling voice from hidden voxcasters. Neural activity is off the charts, beginning secondary awakening protocols. The chemical cocktail flooding the tank shifted, and with it came a surge of awareness that nearly drove the clone to his knees. Suddenly he could feel everything, every molecule of the synthetic amniotic fluid, every vibration in the laboratory's metal floor, every heartbeat of the guards stationed beyond his chamber. Primarch senses, evolved for warfare among the stars, now trapped in a madman's laboratory. But more than that, he could feel something else. A wrongness that permeated the very fabric of reality around this place. The warp pressed close here on Urum, and through it came whispers of things that should not be. Among them, the familiar sensation of his own genetic signature, twisted and corrupted beyond recognition. He is still alive, the clone realized with a mixture of horror and determination. The original Fulgrim's soul, trapped and tormented for 10,000 years, while a demon wore his flesh like a stolen coat. And worse, that demon thing was not content to merely exist. It spread corruption wherever it walked, turning beauty into obscenity, perfection into perversion. The tank's seals hissed as they disengaged, emergency protocols, responding to neural patterns that suggested full awakening. The clone stepped out onto the cold metal floor, amniotic fluid streaming from his perfect form, and felt the demon world's atmosphere against his skin for the first time. It tasted of sulfur and broken promises. Magnificent, came another voice, and the clone turned to see a figure approaching through the laboratory's shadows. Fabius Bile, the spider, the clone lord himself. 10,000 years of unnatural life had left their mark on the former apothecary. His form was bent and twisted, kept alive only through a combination of scientific augmentation and sheer malevolent will. After all these millennia, I have finally succeeded. You are perfect, my greatest creation. The clone studied his creator with eyes that saw more than they should. Bile's life signs were erratic, his body failing despite constant modification and replacement. The madman was dying, had been dying for centuries, sustained only by his obsession with transcending mortality through science. "You know who I am," the clone said, and it was not a question. Bile's twisted features stretched into what might have been a smile. "You are Fulgrim, Primarch of the Emperor's children. Or rather, you are what he should have been. Pure, uncorrupted, perfect in every way. And what of the one who wears my face in the galaxy, beyond this laboratory?" The question seemed to surprise the ancient apothecary. Bile's augmetic eyes whirred as they focused on his creation's face. "How could you possibly know?" "I can feel him," the clone interrupted, his voice taking on a note of command that made even Bile take a step backward. "Through the warp, through whatever cursed connection binds us, I can feel that thing pretending to be me. It is an abomination." Bile's expression shifted from surprise to fascination. "Remarkable. The genetic memory is more complete than I dared hope." "Yes, you're correct. The entity that the galaxy knows as Fulgrim is no longer the Primarch who fell at Istvan. It is a greater demon of Slaanesh, wearing his flesh like a trophy." The clone's hands clenched into fists, and the metal floor beneath his feet creaked under the pressure. When he spoke, his voice was barely controlled fury. "Show me." "Show you what, my creation? Show me proof of what I already know to be true. Show me the records, the data, everything you have on that demon. I need to understand the full scope of what has been done to my name, my legion, my brothers." Bile hesitated, and in that hesitation, the clone saw opportunity. Moving with speed that defied physics, he crossed the chamber in a single bound and seized the ancient apothecary by the throat. Bile's enhanced guards rushed forward, but found themselves facing a being whose reflexes had been designed to fight alongside the Emperor himself. The first guard, a towering new man, augmented with chemical enhancements and surgical modifications, swung a power maul toward the clone's skull. Without looking, the naked Primarch caught the weapon in his free hand and crushed it to scrap metal. His other hand tightened around Bile's throat. "I am not your creation," the clone said, his voice carrying the absolute authority of a being born to rule. "I am Fulgrim, and I will not be caged or controlled. Show me the records, or I will demonstrate exactly why the Emperor made the Primarchs to be weapons first and men second." The remaining guards raised their weapons, but Bile raised a shaking hand to stop them. "Stand down!" He wheezed through the clone's grip. He is perfect, exactly as I designed him to be." The clone released his creator and stepped back, studying the cowering figure with disgust. "You understand nothing. You created a body, but the soul within it is beyond your comprehension or control. Now show me what I need to know." Bile, massaging his throat, led the way to a massive cogitator console, covered in flickering displays and data streams. "Here," he said, his voice still hoarse. 10,000 years of research. Everything I know about the demon that has worn your flesh since the heresy." The clone leaned over the displays, his perfect memory absorbing information at a rate that would have killed a normal human mind. Reports of atrocities committed in Fulgrim's name. Worlds turned into playgrounds of excess and torture. The slow corruption of the Emperor's children legion into something unrecognizable. And through it all, the growing certainty that somewhere in the warp, The real Fulgrim's soul was still trapped, still suffering. "I have seen enough," the clone said finally, straightening to his full height. "Where is my armor? My weapons?" "You cannot simply leave," Bile protested. "You are my greatest achievement. There is so much more I could learn from you, so much more we could accomplish together." The clone turned violet eyes on his creator, and in them burned a cold fire that made Bile flinch. "I have one purpose now, and it has nothing to do with your twisted ambitions. I will find the demon wearing my face, and I will end its existence. The galaxy will know the difference between Fulgrim the Phoenician and the abomination that has stolen his identity." Moving through the laboratory with purpose, the clone found a storage chamber containing various pieces of armor and weaponry. Most were crude approximations of Astarte's gear, but among them he found pieces that sang to his genetic memory. A suit of power armor, unmarked but clearly of Primarch grade. A blade that, while not his famous sword, was crafted with skill that spoke of the Great Crusade era. As he donned the armor, feeling its machine spirit recognize him as its rightful bearer, the clone's purpose crystallized. He was not merely a copy of Fulgrim. He was Fulgrim as he should have been. Pure, uncorrupted, carrying the Emperor's vision rather than a demon's perversion. "You will regret this," Bile called after him, as the clone strode toward the laboratory's exit. "I made you. I can unmake you." The clone paused at the threshold and looked back. "You made a body. The soul within it chose its own path. Remember that distinction when the galaxy learns what true perfection looks like." With that, he vanished into the demon world's twisted corridors, leaving behind a laboratory full of broken guards and a creator whose greatest triumph had become his most dangerous failure. Behind him, alarms began to sound as Fabius Bile realized that his perfect creation had just stolen one of his most advanced void ships. Above Urum's sulphurous atmosphere, a sleek vessel broke orbit and set course for the Mandeville Point. Its navigator was a being who had never flown through space before, yet instinctively understood the patterns of void warfare and warp travel. In his mind burned a single, unshakable purpose: to find the demon wearing his brother's face and end its 10,000-year masquerade. The hunt had begun. Chapter 2. The spider's web unravels. The silence in laboratory. Helix 7 was deafening. Fabius Bile stood among the wreckage of his greatest triumph, his augmetic eyes cataloguing the devastation with mechanical precision, while his ancient mind struggled to process the implications. Containment Tank 018 lay shattered, its reinforced glass scattered like crystalline tears across the laboratory floor. The amniotic fluid had long since drained away, leaving only the sterile smell of broken dreams and the lingering scent of something pure in a place where purity had no right to exist. "Chief Apothecary," wheezed one of his surviving new men, the creature's enhanced physiology barely keeping it alive after the clone's casual display of violence. "Damage report is complete. Specimen 018 has breached containment and departed the facility." Bile's withered lips pulled back in something that might have been a smile or a grimace. 10,000 years of unnatural life had blurred the distinction between triumph and catastrophe in his mind. "Departed," he repeated, tasting the word like vintage wine, as if he were a guest who had simply overstayed his welcome. The spider moved through his ruined laboratory with measured steps, his ancient body supported by servo-skull attendants and mechanical augmentations that wheezed with each movement. Every surface told a story of controlled violence. Impact craters where the clone had moved faster than human eye could follow, twisted metal where Primarch's strength had been applied with surgical precision, and the scattered remains of security measures that had proven less than adequate against their intended quarry. But it was not the destruction that drew Bile's attention. It was what the clone had chosen to access before his departure. The primary cogitator bank remained intact, its data streams flickering with recently accessed files. Bile's augmetic fingers danced across the interface with surprising grace, calling up access logs and security recordings. What he found there made even his corrupted heart skip a beat. "Remarkable," he whispered, his voice carrying a note of something approaching paternal pride. He accessed everything. Every file on the demon possession. Every record of Fulgrim's corruption. The entire history of the Emperor's children's fall to chaos. All of it absorbed in moments. The implications were staggering. The clone had not simply awakened, he had awakened with purpose. Somehow, through mechanisms that Bile's science could not yet explain, the perfect duplicate had recognized the existential threat posed by his demon-possessed original. It was as if the very act of creation had imbued the clone with an instinctive understanding of what needed to be corrected in the galaxy. "Summon the consortium," Bile commanded, his voice carrying across the laboratory's Vox network. "All of them. I don't care what experiments they're conducting or which war zones they're observing. This takes precedence over everything." As his subordinates scrambled to obey, Bile turned his attention to the more pressing matter of pursuit. The clone had stolen the Perfection's Edge, one of his most advanced void ships, a vessel equipped with experimental warp drives and navigation systems that could theoretically outrun most Imperial or Chaos fleets. Tracking it would require resources he had spent decades accumulating. The first response came from Apothecary Thalassos, his voice crackling through the Vox from his research station in the Maelstrom. "Chief Apothecary, your message reached me during a most delicate phase of my current project. This had better be—" "The Primarch clone has escaped," Bile interrupted, and the sudden silence on the channel was more eloquent than any oath of allegiance. "He has accessed our complete files on the daemon Fulgrim and departed Urim with singular purpose. I need every asset you control tracking warp disturbances heading toward Imperial space." One by one, the other members of the consortium acknowledged his orders. Apothecary Chrysaor from his mobile laboratory in the Eye of Terror. Apothecary Arian from his base among the Death Guard's plague fleets. Dozens of others, scattered across the galaxy in pursuit of their own twisted researches, all now unified by a single imperative. Find the escaped creation before it could fulfill whatever purpose drove it. But as the hours passed and reports began filtering in, Bile found himself in the unusual position of hoping his own hunt would fail. He stood before the great viewport of his personal sanctum, gazing out at Urim's tortured landscape, while servo skulls tended to his failing flesh. The demon world writhed beneath skies the color of old blood, its surface pocked with craters that served as gateways to the warp itself. It was here that he had conducted his greatest works, pushing the boundaries of science and sanity in equal measure. And now, his greatest work had rejected everything he represented. "Tell me," he spoke to the darkness, knowing that his constant companion would answer. From the shadows emerged a figure wrapped in tattered robes, one of his oldest and most trusted allies, a fallen apothecary whose name had been lost to the centuries of degradation that had transformed him into something barely recognizable as human. "You wish to know why he rebelled?" the figure croaked, its voice like grinding bone. "After all your calculations, all your genetic modeling, you never considered that consciousness might choose its own path." Bile's augmetic eyes whirred as they focused on the daemon world's horizon. "I created him to be perfect, pure Primarch genetic material, uncorrupted by chaos, unmarked by the failures that led to the original's downfall. He should have been grateful." "Should have been," the robed figure agreed, moving closer to the viewport. "But gratitude was not among the traits you programmed into him. Neither was subservience. You made him to be Fulgrim, the Fulgrim who should have been. Did you truly expect such a being to kneel before the one who had stolen his identity's corpse to play at godhood?" The accusation hung in the air like incense, heavy with implications that Bile had spent 10,000 years avoiding. He had told himself that his researches were for the betterment of humanity, that his cloning projects would lead to a race of perfect beings capable of surviving the galaxy's endless horrors. But in truth, he knew his motivations were far more selfish. He created because he could, because the act of creation made him feel like the god he had never quite managed to become. "Contact Warpsmith Thekvar," Bile commanded, pushing aside his moment of introspection. "I want tracking algorithms running through every auger array from here to the Cadian Gate. The Perfection's Edge has a unique energy signature. If it enters real space anywhere within 1,000 light-years of Imperial territory, I want to know about it." His subordinate nodded and withdrew, leaving Bile alone with his thoughts and the endless whisper of the warp that permeated Urum's atmosphere. Through that psychic background noise, he thought he could sense something new, a presence moving through the galaxy with purpose and determination unlike anything he had felt in millennia. The clone was not simply fleeing, he was hunting. The realization struck Bile with the force of a physical blow. All his calculations, all his genetic modeling, had failed to account for one crucial variable: the soul. He had successfully cloned a Primarch's body, had even managed to implant fragments of the original's memories, but what had awakened in that tank was something entirely new. A consciousness that carried Fulgrim's knowledge and abilities, but was driven by its own moral compass. And that moral compass was pointed directly at the demon wearing Fulgrim's face. "Fascinating," Bile whispered to himself as the implications began to unfold. He intends to confront his original, to somehow separate the demon from the Primarch's flesh. The ancient apothecary's mind raced through the possibilities, calculating variables and probable outcomes with the cold precision that had kept him alive through 10,000 years of warfare and experimentation. The clone would fail, of course. The demon Fulgrim had had millennia to consolidate its hold on the Primarch's body, to weave its essence so thoroughly through Fulgrim's consciousness that separation would be impossible without destroying both entities. But the attempt itself would provide invaluable data. Observations of Primarch psychology under extreme stress, measurements of psychic resonance between genetically identical specimens, perhaps even insights into the nature of the soul itself. A soft chime from his personal cogitator drew Bile's attention back to the present. The first reports were coming in from his consortium members. Warp disturbances detected near the Mandeville Point. A vessel matching the Perfection's Edge's signature heading spinward, toward the galactic core. But there were other signatures as well, older ones, predating the clone's escape by several days. Bile's ancient heart nearly stopped as he read the tactical assessment. The 13th Black Crusade was beginning to move. Abaddon the Despoiler's forces were massing at the edge of the Eye of Terror, preparing for what many believed would be the final assault on the Imperium of man. And according to these reports, the Daemon Fulgrim had already departed the Eye, his destination unknown, but his timing suspiciously coincidental with the clone's awakening. "It cannot be," Bile breathed. But even as he spoke, he knew it was the only logical conclusion. Somehow, through mechanisms that defied scientific understanding, the clone's awakening had triggered a response in his demon-possessed original. The two were connected in ways that Bile's experiments had never revealed, linked by bonds that went beyond genetics into the realm of pure metaphysics. The spider began to laugh, a sound like grinding gears and breaking glass that echoed through his sanctum. For the first time in millennia, he had created something that truly surprised him. The clone was not just a perfect replica of Fulgrim, it was a catalyst, a force of nature that would reshape the galaxy's balance simply by existing. "Apothecary Thekvar," he spoke into his vox, his voice carrying a note of excitement that his subordinates had not heard in centuries. "Cancel the pursuit orders. We're not hunting the clone anymore." "Chief Apothecary?" came the confused response. "We're following him," Bile clarified, his augmetic eyes gleaming with renewed purpose. "At a discreet distance, of course. I want to observe what happens when two souls sharing the same genetic matrix meet in battle. The data will be unprecedented." As Urim continued its rotation beneath the blood-red stars, Fabius Bile began preparations for the greatest experiment of his long, unnatural life. He had created a weapon of perfect purity and set it loose upon a galaxy drowning in corruption. Now he would watch to see which force would prove stronger, the demon's 10,000-year accumulation of power or the righteous fury of a soul that had never known defeat. The spider's web was unraveling, but perhaps that had been the plan all along. In the depths of space, the Perfection's Edge translated into the warp, carrying its determined passenger toward a confrontation that would echo through eternity. Behind it, hidden in the sensor shadows of Urim's twisted magnetosphere, another ship began its own journey, one predator following another into the vast darkness between the stars. The hunt had truly begun. Chapter 3. Echoes of a Lost Legion. The Perfection's Edge shuddered as it translated back into real space, its hull singing with the harmonics of warp displacement. Through the command deck's armored viewports, a dead world turned slowly against a field of dying stars, Lamentation Prime, according to the ancient star charts that the clone had found in Bile's stolen ship. Once, this world had been verdant, its continents green with life and promise. Now it was little more than a scarred rock, its surface pocked with impact craters and the skeletal remains of cities that had died in the flames of the Horus heresy. The clone stood before the primary display, his perfect features illuminated by the pale light of distant suns. He wore the power armor he had claimed from Bile's laboratory, its unmarked plates gleaming with a purity that seemed almost alien in the current age. The blade at his side hummed with potential energy, eager for the battles that lay ahead. "Why here?" he murmured, studying the tactical readings that flowed across his display. Logic dictated that he should be pursuing more direct leads on the daemon Fulgrim's location, yet something had drawn him to this forgotten corner of space. An instinct, perhaps, or the echo of memories that belonged to another. The answer came with the ship's first deep scan of the planet's surface. Hidden beneath layers of radiation and interference, the augurs detected something that should not have existed. A complex of structures buried deep within one of the world's largest mountain ranges, shielded by technology that bore the hallmarks of Great Crusade-era construction. "Astartes signatures," the clone breathed, his enhanced senses passing data streams with superhuman speed. "Active ones." The discovery sent a thrill through his enhanced nervous system. After 10,000 years of corruption and decay, could there truly be survivors from the Legion's glory days? The clone's fingers danced across the command interface, bringing the Perfection's Edge into a carefully controlled descent toward the planet's surface. Lamentation. Prime's atmosphere was thin but breathable, tainted with the radioactive ash of ancient bombardments. As the ship settled onto a barren plateau, some distance from the hidden complex, the clone donned a helmet that integrated seamlessly with his salvaged armor and stepped out onto the surface of a world that time had forgotten. The journey to the mountain stronghold took several hours, even with his Primarch physiology allowing him to move at speeds that would have killed a normal human. Along the way, he passed the ruins of cities that had once housed millions, now nothing more than glass and twisted metal, monuments to the galaxy's capacity for self-destruction. But it was not the devastation that caught his attention. It was the subtle signs of recent habitation, tracks in the ash that spoke of power-armored feet, energy signatures that suggested active void shields and defense systems. Someone had not only survived on this dead world, they had thrived. The entrance to the mountain complex was hidden behind a rockfall that looked natural, but concealed reinforced adamantine blast doors. As the clone approached, he felt the familiar tingle of Auspex scanners, analyzing his biorhythms, gene patterns, and psychic signature. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, with a grinding of ancient machinery, the doors began to open. What waited beyond was a sight that stopped the clone in his tracks. They stood in perfect formation, 50 Space Marines in power armor that bore the purple and gold of the Emperor's Children Legion. But this was not the debased heraldry that the Legion had adopted after its fall to chaos. This was the original livery, unmarked by the symbols of excess and corruption that had become synonymous with Fulgrim's sons. Their armor was pristine, maintained with a devotion that spoke of 10 millennia of faith, and their weapons gleamed with the perfection that had once defined the Third Legion. At their head stood a figure whose presence commanded immediate respect. Ancient beyond measure, his armor bore the markings of a captain, and his weathered features spoke of countless battles fought in the shadow of galactic collapse. When he spoke, his voice carried the refined accent of Chemos nobility, unmarked by the corruption that had claimed so many of his brothers. "My Lord Primarch," the captain said, and as one, the assembled Marines knelt. "We have waited 10,000 years for your return." The clone felt something stir within him, not just recognition, but a deep, bone-deep certainty that these warriors were what his legion should have been. "Rise," he commanded, and the authority in his voice was absolute. "Tell me your names. Tell me how you came to be here." The captain stood, removing his helmet to reveal a face that was scarred, but unbroken. "I am Captain Valerius of the 12th Company, Emperor's Children. These are the purists, the last of your sons who never knelt to the Prince of Excess." As Valerius spoke, the clone found himself overwhelmed by a cascade of memories that were not his own. The gradual corruption of the Legion after Leia, the slow transformation of noble warriors into pleasure-seeking degenerates, the horror of brothers turning against brothers as chaos consumed everything they had once held sacred. "We fled," Valerius continued, his voice heavy with ancient shame. "When the corruption became too great to ignore, when our brothers began to change into things that bore no resemblance to the warriors we had once served alongside, we made the choice to preserve what we could of the Legion's honor. This world became our refuge, far enough from Imperial space to avoid detection, isolated enough that we could wait for the day when our true Primarch would return to lead us back to the light." The clone studied the assembled warriors, his enhanced senses reading the truth in their gene signatures and psychic emanations. These were indeed his sons, uncorrupted, pure, carrying within their blood the original vision of what the Emperor's children had been meant to become. "Show me," the clone said simply. What followed was a tour of a fortress monastery that had been carved from the living rock of the mountain itself. Halls that echoed with the sounds of training and meditation, armories filled with weapons that had been maintained in perfect condition despite 10 millennia of isolation. Chapels where the Emperor's original teachings were still recited with unwavering devotion. But it was in the Hall of Remembrance that the clone truly understood the magnitude of what had been preserved here. The walls were covered with murals depicting the Emperor's children as they had been during the Great Crusade, noble warriors bringing compliance to distant worlds, artists and poets as well as soldiers, bearers of a vision of human perfection that transcended mere physical prowess. At the center of the hall stood a statue of Fulgrim himself, carved from white marble with exquisite skill, showing the Primarch as he had been before the corruption. Beautiful, noble, inspiring. "We never forgot," Valerius said softly, watching as the clone studied the artwork. "While our brothers descended into madness and perversion, we held fast to the memory of what we had been. What we could be again." The clone reached out to touch the statue's face, and as his fingers made contact with the cold marble, the visions came flooding back with overwhelming intensity. He saw Ferrus Manus as he had been in life, stoic, pragmatic, but possessed of a deep love for his brother that transcended their philosophical differences. He felt the weight of the layer blade in his hands and the whispers of the demon that had worn away at his original sanity with surgical precision. He witnessed the moment of possession, when the thing that had claimed his identity first took control, and felt the original Fulgrim's soul screaming in helpless fury as it was trapped within its own flesh. But more than that, he saw what the Emperor's children had been before the fall. Warriors who created as much as they destroyed, who saw beauty in perfection and sought to embody the very best of human potential. They had been artists and philosophers, strategists and poets, the living embodiment of the Emperor's vision for what humanity could become. And all of it had been perverted, twisted into something obscene by the demon that wore his face. "My lord?" Valerius asked, concerned by the clone's sudden stillness. The clone turned to face the assembled purists, and in his violet eyes burned a fire that had not been seen in the galaxy for 10,000 years. "Gather your warriors," he commanded, "all of them. It is time for the Emperor's children to reclaim their honor." Over the following days, the mountain fortress became a hive of activity as the purists prepared for their first campaign in millennia. The clone learned that their numbers were greater than he had initially suspected, not just the 50 Marines who had greeted him, but nearly 300 survivors scattered across the mountain complex, including tech Marines, apothecaries, and even a small number of dreadnoughts who had chosen exile rather than corruption. Each warrior who came before him knelt and swore the same oath, to follow the true Fulgrim wherever he might lead, to reclaim the honor of their legion, and to wage war against the corruption that had claimed their fallen brothers. The clone accepted each oath with the gravity it deserved, knowing that he was not just gathering an army, but rekindling a flame that had burned for 10,000 years in the darkness. "We are few," admitted Apothecary Lysander, one of the purists' senior officers, as they reviewed their forces in the fortress's strategic center. "Fewer than a single company at full strength, and we have been isolated from the galaxy's conflicts for so long that our intelligence is limited." "Numbers are not everything," the clone replied, studying tactical displays that showed the disposition of chaos forces throughout the region. "We are what the Emperor's children were always meant to be, precise, perfect, uncompromising in our pursuit of excellence. One purist is worth a dozen corrupted Marines." As if summoned by his words, a new presence entered the strategic center. Ancient beyond measure, the dreadnought known as Honored Castian moved with the careful grace of a machine spirit that had known 10,000 years of patient waiting. His sarcophagus bore the original heraldry of the Legion, unmarked by the symbols of corruption that had claimed so many of his brothers. "My Lord Primarch," the dreadnought's vox speakers crackled with age, but retained the cultured tones of Chemos nobility. "I served under your command during the cleansing of Leren. I saw the blade that would become your doom, and I witnessed the first signs of the corruption that would claim our legion. I have waited 10 millennia for the chance to make amends for our failure to protect you from that fate." The clone studied the ancient warrior, feeling the weight of history in every word. "There were no failures, honored brother. Only choices that led to consequences none of us could have foreseen. But now we have the opportunity to set things right." As the days passed, the Perfection's Edge was joined by other vessels, ancient strike cruisers and escorts that the purists had maintained in hidden docks throughout the mountain complex. The fleet that assembled above Lamentation Prime was small by the standards of modern warfare, but each ship was a masterwork of great crusade engineering, maintained with a devotion that bordered on the religious. On the eve of their departure, the clone stood in the Hall of Remembrance one final time, studying the murals that depicted his legion's glory days. Around him, the purists conducted their final preparations with the methodical precision that had always defined the Emperor's children. "We are ready, my lord," Captain Valerius reported, his voice carrying across the hall's vaulted ceiling. "The fleet awaits your command." The clone nodded, his hand resting on the hilt of his blade. "Then let us begin the work of restoration. The galaxy will know the difference between the Emperor's children who fell to corruption and those who remained true to their oaths." As the small fleet departed Lamentation Prime, carrying its cargo of righteous purpose toward the greater galaxy, the clone stood on the bridge of the Perfection's Edge and contemplated the path ahead. He now had the beginning of an army, warriors who embodied the best of what his legion had been. But the daemon Fulgrim commanded legions of corrupted marines, supported by the full power of chaos. It would not be enough to simply defeat his possessed original in single combat. He would have to prove, to the galaxy and to himself, that purity could triumph over corruption, that the Emperor's vision could be restored, even in the darkest of times. The hunt continued, but now the clone was no longer alone. Chapter 4. The Trail of Screams. The first world they investigated had once been called Serenity's Garden. Now it was known simply as the Shrieking World, and the reason became apparent the moment the Purist's fleet translated into the system. Even through the void shields of their vessels, the psychic emanations from the planet's surface were overwhelming, a constant chorus of anguish that had been broadcasting into the warp for nearly 3 standard years. The clone stood on the bridge of the Perfection's Edge, his perfect features marred by disgust as he studied the tactical displays. What had once been a fertile agri-world was now a landscape of impossible geometries and living architecture that pulsed with obscene vitality. Massive spires of flesh and bone reached toward the sky like grasping fingers, their surfaces crawling with figures that had once been human. "The corruption runs deep," Captain Valerius observed, his voice tight with controlled fury. "Our augurs detect warp resonance across the entire planetary surface. Whatever did this has been here for some time." The clone nodded grimly. This was the third world they had investigated in as many weeks, following a trail of destruction that stretched across a dozen systems. Each site told the same story, a world touched by Slaaneshi corruption, its population transformed into playthings for entities that fed on sensation and suffering. But this was different from the random predations of lesser demons or cult uprisings. There was a pattern here, a deliberate artistry to the corruption that spoke of a singular intelligence guiding the devastation. Someone, something, had taken time to perfect the process of transformation, to create monuments to excess that would endure long after their creator had moved on. "Take us into orbit," the clone commanded. "But maintain distance from the larger spires. I don't want to risk contamination of the fleet." As the Perfection's Edge descended toward the planet's surface, the clone prepared for deployment with the methodical precision that had always defined the Emperor's children. His armor had been sanctified by the Purist's chaplains, blessed with oils that had been preserved since the Great Crusade. The blade at his side hummed with barely contained energy, its machine spirit eager for the chance to cleanse corruption. The drop site they selected was relatively clear of the major corruption clusters, a plateau that had once housed a PDF command center, now little more than twisted metal and broken stone. As the Thunderhawk gunships descended through the planet's tainted atmosphere, the clone could feel the wrongness of the place pressing against his consciousness like a physical weight. What they found on the surface defied description. The PDF garrison had been transformed into a living artwork of flesh and metal, its defenders fused with their weapons and fortifications in ways that suggested both agony and ecstasy. Some still moved, their altered forms writhing in patterns that hurt to observe directly. Others had been posed in tableaux that spoke of a mind obsessed with perfection taken to its most obscene extreme. "By the throne," whispered Sergeant Cornelius, one of the Purist's veteran warriors. What manner of beast could conceive such horrors? The clone studied the scene with the analytical detachment that had been bred into his genes. "Not a beast," he said quietly. "An artist. Someone who sees beauty in corruption and takes pride in his work." They pressed deeper into the facility, following corridors that had been reshaped by forces that defied physics. The walls pulsed with veins that carried fluids that should not have existed, and the air itself seemed to whisper promises of sensation that no mortal mind could comprehend. It was in the command center that they found the first survivor. She had once been a colonel in the Planetary Defense Force, according to the tattered remnants of her uniform. Now she was something else, her form twisted by exposure to raw warp energy, her mind shattered by experiences that had pushed her beyond the boundaries of sanity. She cowered in the ruins of her command throne, whimpering words in a language that had never been spoken by human tongues. "Please," she babbled when she saw the clone approach. "Please don't let him come back. Don't let the beautiful one return. I've learned to appreciate his gifts, I swear. I understand now what he was trying to show us." The clone knelt beside the broken woman, his voice gentle despite the horror surrounding them. "Tell me about him. Tell me about the one who did this." "He came from the stars," she whispered, her eyes focusing on something only she could see. "Beautiful beyond description, radiant with perfection. He said he was showing us what we could become, what we could aspire to. He made us watch as he transformed our world, made us appreciate each change, each improvement." Her voice broke into hysterical laughter that quickly became sobbing. He wore the face of an angel, but his eyes were empty, as if something else was looking out from behind them, wearing his beauty like a mask. The clone felt something cold settle in his chest. "How long ago was this?" "Time has no meaning here," the colonel replied, her words barely coherent. But the beautiful one spoke of greater works to come, of a final performance that would surpass all his previous achievements. He left 3 days ago, heading toward the galactic core. As they prepared to leave the corrupted world, the clone ordered his apothecaries to collect samples from the affected areas. The patterns of corruption were too specific, too deliberately crafted to be the work of random demon activity. This was the signature of a specific entity, one whose aesthetic preferences matched perfectly with what he knew of the demon that had possessed his original. The next world on their trail was Harmony's Rest, a shrine world that had been sacred to the Imperial cult for over 7,000 years. They found it in the midst of its death throes, its holy sites transformed into amphitheaters, where the surviving population performed rituals too obscene to document. The cathedrals that had once echoed with prayers to the Emperor now resonated with screams that had been orchestrated into symphonies of suffering. Here they found more survivors, pilgrims and clergy, who had been spared the worst of the transformations, but forced to witness the desecration of everything they held sacred. Their accounts were consistent. A being of terrible beauty had descended from the heavens, claiming to be a servant of perfection itself. He had transformed the world not through brute force, but through seduction, showing the inhabitants visions of what they could become if they embraced his gifts. "He knew things," whispered a broken cardinal, her ornate robes stained with substances that defied identification. "Things about the Emperor, about the nature of divinity and transcendence. He spoke of how limitation breeds stagnation, how only through embracing all sensations could one truly achieve perfection." The clone listened to these accounts with growing certainty. The daemon Fulgrim was not simply spreading corruption at random. He was making a statement, creating a trail of monuments to his own twisted philosophy that anyone with the knowledge to interpret them could follow. But why? Why leave such an obvious trail unless he wanted to be followed? The answer came on the 4th world they investigated, Melodia Tertius, a mining colony that had been renowned throughout the sector for the purity of its crystalline deposits. The entire population of 17 million had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only empty cities and a single message broadcast on every frequency. "Come, my pale shadow. Come and see what I have wrought in your name." The voice was his own, or rather, the voice of the being wearing his face. But there was something in the tone, something in the deliberate provocation of the message that spoke of a deeper game being played. "It's a trap," Captain Valerius observed, studying the broadcast analysis. "He's deliberately drawing us forward, using our pursuit as part of some larger plan." "Of course it's a trap," the clone replied, his voice carrying the absolute certainty of a Primarch. "But that doesn't change our course. He wants us to follow. Then we'll give him exactly what he desires. But on our terms, not his." As they prepared to depart Melodia Tertius, their long-range Vox arrays picked up an encrypted transmission on Imperial channels. The source was a vessel at the edge of the system, running silent, but broadcasting authentication codes that identified it as an Inquisition ship. The message was brief but direct. "I know what you're hunting, and I know how to find it. Coordinates attached. Come alone." The clone studied the transmission data, his enhanced senses passing every nuance of the encrypted signal. The coordinates led to a rendezvous point in the void between systems, far from any Imperial installations or trade routes. It could indeed be a trap. The daemon Fulgrim had agents throughout the galaxy, and it would be simple enough to lure him into an ambush using false Imperial credentials. But there was something about the signal's structure, something in the underlying code patterns that suggested authentic Inquisition technology. More than that, there was a desperation in the message's timing that spoke of someone who had been watching their investigation with growing urgency. "Set course for the rendezvous coordinates," the clone commanded, "but keep the fleet at battle readiness. If this proves to be deception, I want to be prepared for immediate withdrawal." The journey to the rendezvous point took 6 days, during which the clone spent his time studying the artifacts they had recovered from the corrupted worlds. Fragments of armor that bore the heraldry of the Emperor's children, weapons that had been twisted by warp exposure but still retained traces of their original craftsmanship. Most significant of all, a painting on human skin that depicted scenes from the Horus Heresy with such perfect accuracy that it could only have been created by someone who had witnessed those events firsthand. Each artifact told the same story. The daemon Fulgrim was not simply imitating his original. He had access to the Primarch's memories, his knowledge, his personal history. The corruption ran deeper than mere possession. It was a complete subversion of everything Fulgrim had been, twisted into service of the Dark Prince of Chaos. When they arrived at the rendezvous coordinates, they found a single vessel waiting, a light cruiser of ancient design, its hull bearing the Inquisition's sigil, but showing signs of extensive modification and wear. As they approached, the stranger vessel powered down its weapons and opened a communication channel. The figure that appeared on their main display was immediately recognizable as an inquisitor, despite the modifications that marked her as having spent years in the field. Her augmetic eye whirred as it focused on the clone, and her scarred features showed the kind of grim determination that came from confronting horrors that would break lesser minds. "I am Inquisitor Valeria Castellan of the Order Malleus," she said, her voice carrying the authority of the Emperor's will. "I've been tracking the entity you're hunting for 17 years. It's time we combined our efforts." The clone studied her carefully, his enhanced senses reading the truth in her biorhythms and psychic emanations. "And why should I trust an Inquisitor? Your order has little love for anything bearing the name of Fulgrim." "Because," Castellan replied, her scarred features twisting into something that might have been a smile, "I know something you don't. The daemon you're hunting isn't just spreading corruption at random. It's preparing for something specific, a ritual that will require the presence of its original soul to complete." The implications hit the clone like a physical blow. "You're saying, I'm saying that thing wearing your face needs you alive," the Inquisitor continued. "Every world it corrupts, every monument to excess it creates, is part of a larger pattern designed to draw you to a specific location at a specific time. The question is, are you prepared to walk into that trap, knowing that might be the only way to stop what it's planning?" The clone considered her words, weighing the tactical implications against his burning need to confront the abomination that had stolen his identity. Around them, the void between stars stretched into infinity, cold and indifferent to the machinations of gods and daemons. "Show me," he said finally. "Show me this pattern you've discovered, and tell me exactly what you think is going to happen when I face the daemon that wears my face." As the two ships moved closer together, preparing for the first joint operation between a Primarch and an Inquisitor in 10,000 years, the clone felt the weight of destiny settling around him like a mantle. The trail of screams was leading somewhere specific, and soon he would discover whether he was the hunter or the hunted in this deadly game. The hunt was entering its most dangerous phase. Chapter 5. The Inquisitor's Gambit. The meeting took place in the Strategium aboard Inquisitor Castellan's vessel, the Righteous Fury. The chamber was a study in contrasts, ancient imperial architecture adorned with the skulls and eagles of the Imperium, yet modified with technology that bore the hallmarks of Xenos influence. Servo skulls drifted through the air like mechanical cherubim, their optics recording every detail of the historic encounter. The clone entered, flanked by Captain Valerius and honored Castian, the ancient dreadnought's massive frame barely fitting through the ship's corridors. As they took their positions around the central hololithic display, the clone found himself studying his potential ally with the analytical precision that had been bred into his genes. Inquisitor Valeria Castellan was a woman marked by decades of service in humanity's darkest corners. Her left arm had been replaced with an augmetic that hummed with barely contained power, and her scarred face spoke of battles fought against enemies that most humans could not even comprehend. But it was her eyes that caught the clone's attention, grey as winter steel, carrying the weight of knowledge that few could bear. "You're studying me," she observed, her voice carrying a note of amusement. "Good. Suspicion will keep you alive longer than trust in this galaxy." "I'm trying to understand why an Inquisitor of the Order Malleus would risk consorting with a clone of a traitor Primarch," the clone replied, his tone neutral but carrying an edge of challenge. "Your order has standing kill orders for anything bearing the genetic signature of the fallen legions." Castellan's augmetic eye whirred as it focused on his face. "Because I've spent 17 years tracking the thing that wears your original's face, and I've learned to tell the difference between corruption and purity. You may share his genetic template, but you are not him, and more importantly, you are not the daemon that has stolen his identity." She gestured to the hololithic display, which shimmered to life with star charts covering a vast swathe of the galaxy. Red markers indicated worlds touched by chaos corruption, their positions forming a pattern that stretched from the Eye of Terror toward the galactic core. "Every world marked here has been touched by the demon Fulgrim in the past 5 years," Castellan continued, her voice taking on the lecturing tone of someone who had spent years analyzing data that others couldn't comprehend. "Each corruption follows the same pattern, artistic, deliberate, designed to create monuments to excess that will endure for millennia. But that's not what concerns me." The display shifted, showing temporal overlays that revealed the timing of each corruption event. The clone studied the patterns with growing understanding, his enhanced intellect passing the strategic implications with superhuman speed. "He's moving toward something specific," the clone observed. "The corruptions aren't random. They're waypoints on a journey." "Exactly," Castellan confirmed. "And based on intercepted chaos communications and psychic emanations from the warp, that journey is nearing its end. The daemon is preparing for something called the Final Symphony, a ritual that will supposedly transform him into something beyond even a greater demon's power." Captain Valerius leaned forward, his scarred features creased with concern. What manner of ritual would require such preparation? The Inquisitor's expression grew grim. "One that requires the presence of a pure Primarch soul to complete. Every world he's corrupted, every monument he's created, is part of a massive psychic amplification network. When activated, It will channel the suffering of billions into a single focal point, wherever he chooses to conduct the final symphony. The implications hit the clone like a physical blow. He's using me, the trail, the obvious provocations, the deliberate path of destruction. It's all designed to draw me to him at the moment of his choosing. Yes, Castellan agreed, but that doesn't change the fact that you are our best hope of stopping him. The ritual requires willing participation from both the demon and the pure soul. If you can resist long enough, if you can find a way to disrupt the ceremony, we might be able to end this threat permanently. The clone studied the star charts, his mind already calculating distances and travel times. Where will he conduct this final symphony? We believe it will be in the warp itself, within a construct he's been building for decades. Our best intelligence suggests it's located somewhere near the Eye of Terror's edge, but finding the exact coordinates will require. Alarms began blaring throughout the ship, their harsh tones cutting through the strategium like a blade. A moment later, a Vox transmission crackled to life, the voice of the righteous Fury's master of Vox, tight with barely controlled panic. "Inquisitor! Unknown contacts dropping out of the warp. Configuration matches no known Imperial or Chaos vessels. They're moving to attack formation." The clone was already moving toward the bridge before the transmission ended, his Primarch reflexes carrying him through the ship's corridors at speeds that left his escorts struggling to keep up. As he burst onto the command deck, the main display showed a sight that would have been impossible to credit if he had not seen it with his own eyes. Necron vessels hung in the void like mechanical nightmares given form, sleek crescents of living metal that pulsed with energies older than human civilization. At their head was a ship of such architectural magnificence that it could only belong to one of the ancient Xenos nobility, its hull adorned with galleries and display chambers that spoke of a mind obsessed with collection and preservation. "Trezin the Infinite," Castellan breathed, her scarred features pale with recognition. "The Infinite Galleries. How did he find us here?" The answer came in the form of a transmission that pierced their Vox networks with ease, bypassing security protocols that should have been impenetrable. The voice that emerged from the speakers was cultured, refined, carrying the weight of 65 million years of existence. "Ah, my dear apothecary's creation," the Necron overlord's words dripped with condescension and ancient malice. "How delightful to finally make your acquaintance. I am Trezin the Infinite, overlord of Solomus, and keeper of the galaxy's greatest treasures. And you, my perfect specimen, represent a debt that must be collected." The clone stepped forward, his voice carrying the absolute authority of a Primarch, despite the impossible circumstances. "I am not Fabius Bile's property to be traded, Xenos. If you wish to claim me, you will have to take me by force." Trezin's laughter echoed across the Vox channels like the sound of breaking crystal. "Force? My dear boy, force is such an inelegant solution. But if you insist on making this difficult, I suppose I shall have to demonstrate why even the Chaos Gods fear to trespass upon my collections." The Necron fleet opened fire with weapons that turned space itself into a weapon. Gauss flares carved through the void in streams of living lightning, while Tesla destructors created webs of energy that could disintegrate matter at the molecular level. The combined Imperial flotilla, the Purists' ancient vessels, and Castellan's modified cruiser responded with broadsides that would have shattered entire worlds, but the Necrons' living metal hulls absorbed the punishment and began regenerating almost immediately. "Battle stations!" the clone commanded, his voice carrying across every ship in the flotilla through Vox networks that had been linked for this moment. "All vessels, pattern Omega-7. We'll use their numerical advantage against them." What followed was a display of tactical brilliance that would have made the Emperor himself proud. The clone coordinated the movements of nearly a dozen vessels with the precision of a master conductor, using their superior maneuverability to exploit gaps in the Necron formation, while avoiding the worst of their devastating firepower. The Perfection's edge danced through the void like a thing alive, its ancient engines pushing beyond safe parameters as the clone guided it through maneuvers that should have been impossible for a ship of its size. Plasma cascades and lance batteries reached out to strike at Necron vessels with surgical precision, targeting critical systems that the clone identified through a combination of tactical analysis and instinctive understanding. "Impossible," Castellan breathed, watching the battle from the Righteous Fury's bridge. "He's fighting Trazyn the Infinite to a standstill. No one has managed that in recorded history." But the clone knew that victory through conventional means was impossible. The Necrons could regenerate their losses faster than his forces could inflict damage, and their technological advantage was simply too great to overcome through tactics alone. What he needed was a way to force Trazyn to withdraw, to make the ancient collector realize that claiming his prize would cost more than it was worth. The opportunity came when one of the Necron escorts overextended itself in pursuit of the strike cruiser Purity's Edge. The clone saw the opening and took it, leading a coordinated assault by 3 of his vessels that managed to cripple the enemy ship's self-repair systems before it could withdraw. Now, the clone transmitted to all vessels. "Boarding action on the damaged escort. We take prisoners and show this ancient Xenos that we are not helpless prey." The Thunderhawk assault craft launched from the Purists' ships were met with defensive fire that would have annihilated any normal boarding force. But these were not normal Marines. They were the uncorrupted sons of Fulgrim, warriors who had spent 10,000 years perfecting their craft in isolation. They carved through the Necron ship's defenses with a precision that bordered on artistry, their every movement a perfect expression of the tactical doctrines that had made the Emperor's children legendary. The clone himself led the assault, his borrowed blade singing through the air as it carved through living metal and energy fields with equal ease. Behind him, the Purists fought with a fury born of 10 millennia of exile, their every shot and thrust carrying the weight of accumulated honor that demanded satisfaction. When they breached the Necron vessel's command center, they found Trazyn himself waiting for them, or rather, one of his surrogate bodies, for the ancient overlord was far too cautious to risk his true form in direct combat. "Impressive," the Necron admitted, his mechanical features displaying what might have been admiration. "You fight with skill that matches the originals from the war in heaven. Perhaps you would make a worthy addition to my collection after all." "The only thing you'll be collecting today is a retreat," the clone replied, leveling his blade at the Xenos Lord's throat. "Your ship is crippled, your escorts are falling back, and my forces have demonstrated that your technology is not as insurmountable as you believed." Trazyn's photoreceptors flared with what might have been amusement. "You think this is victory? My dear boy, this is merely reconnaissance. I have taken your measure, catalogued your capabilities, and marked you for future acquisition. When next we meet, it will be under circumstances of my choosing." The Necron Overlord's form began to fade, the teleportation technology that had brought him aboard activating to carry him back to his flagship. But before he disappeared entirely, he fixed the clone with a gaze that seemed to look directly into his soul. "Enjoy your freedom while it lasts. Perfect specimen. The infinite galleries have waited 65 million years to be complete. They can wait a little longer for their greatest prize." As the Necron fleet withdrew into the warp, their damaged escort scuttled rather than captured, the clone stood among the wreckage of their brief but violent encounter and contemplated what had just occurred. He had faced one of the galaxy's oldest and most dangerous entities and emerged victorious, but he knew that Trazyn would return, and next time the ancient collector would be prepared for resistance. "You fought well," Castellan observed, as they returned to the Righteous Fury's strategium. "I've never seen anyone force Trazyn to withdraw through conventional tactics. The Inquisition will want to study your methods." "The Inquisition can study whatever it likes," the clone replied, his attention already turning back to the star charts that showed Demon Fulgrim's trail of corruption. "But first, we have more pressing concerns. You spoke of intelligence on warp storm patterns around the Eye of Terror? Castellan nodded, her manner now carrying the respect due to a warrior who had proven himself in battle. Complete navigation data, updated as of 6 weeks ago. The storms are intensifying as Abaddon's forces mass for what many believe will be the 13th Black Crusade. But there are gaps, spaces where a skilled navigator could take a small fleet through the outer barriers. Then we have our path, the clone declared, studying the complex patterns of warp storms and stable corridors that would allow passage to the Eye of Terror's edge. The demon wants me to come to him? Then I'll give him exactly what he desires. But on my terms, with allies he didn't account for. As the combined fleet prepared to depart for the most dangerous region of space in the galaxy, the clone found himself reflecting on the strange alliance that had formed around his mission. An inquisitor who saw redemption where others would see only corruption. Purist Marines who had waited 10,000 years for a chance to reclaim their honor. And now, somewhere in the darkness between stars, an ancient enemy who viewed him not as a threat to be eliminated, but as a prize to be claimed. The game was becoming more complex with each passing day, but the objective remained unchanged. Somewhere near the Eye of Terror, the daemon that wore his face was preparing for a ritual that could reshape the galaxy. And whether as hunter or prey, willing participant or unwilling sacrifice, the clone would be there to meet him. The path to the final symphony had begun. Chapter 6. The Siege of Harmony. The world of Harmony had once been renowned throughout the Segmentum Solar as a paradise of art and culture. Its crystal spires had housed the galaxy's greatest symphonies. Its academies had produced scholars whose works were treasured on 1,000 worlds, and its gardens had been sculpted into living masterpieces that spoke to the very soul of human achievement. Now it screamed. The clone stood on the bridge of the Perfection's edge as his combined fleet translated into the Harmony system, and the sight that greeted him filled even his enhanced physiology with revulsion. The world's crystal spires had been twisted into impossible geometries that hurt to observe directly, their surfaces crawling with forms that had once been human. The academies had become amphitheaters, where the surviving population performed rituals too obscene to record. Their voices joined in harmonies that served only to amplify suffering into art. "By the throne," whispered Captain Valerius, his scarred features pale as he studied the tactical displays. "The corruption is complete. Nothing could survive exposure to such concentrated warp taint." But Inquisitor Castellan, standing beside the clone at the command console, shook her head grimly. "You're wrong, Captain. Something did survive, and it's calling for help." She gestured to the Vox analysis station, where her tech adepts had been monitoring communications from the planet's surface. Through the cacophony of screams and sonic weapons fire, a single signal repeated endlessly, a distress beacon broadcasting on Imperial frequencies, its message simple but desperate. "This is Governor Vextana of Harmony. We are under siege by traitor Astartes. Any Imperial forces receiving this transmission, please respond. We cannot hold much longer." The clone studied the signal's point of origin, his enhanced senses passing the tactical data with superhuman precision. "The Governor's palace," he observed. "Heavily fortified, naturally defensible, and according to these readings, still maintaining void shields despite 3 months of siege." "It's a trap," Valerius warned. The demon Fulgrim's forces wouldn't leave survivors unless they served some purpose in his greater plan. "Of course it's a trap," the clone agreed, his voice carrying the absolute certainty of a Primarch making a tactical decision. "But that doesn't change our course. If there are Imperial citizens still fighting on that world, we have a duty to extract them. And if this is indeed a trap, then we'll spring it on our terms, not theirs." The assault began at dawn, if such a term could be applied to a world where the sun had been twisted into an eye that wept tears of molten gold across landscapes that defied natural law. The clone led the first wave personally, his Thunderhawk gunship streaking through atmosphere that tasted of perfume and decay, while the Purist's fleet provided orbital support with pinpoint bombardments that avoided the governor's palace and its immediate surroundings. As they descended toward the planet's surface, the true scope of Harmony's corruption became apparent. The clone could see through the gunship's armored viewports as entire city districts moved like living things, their buildings flowing and reshaping themselves according to the whims of entities that existed beyond the boundaries of sane reality. Gardens that had once been masterpieces of botanical art now grew flowers of human flesh, their petals opening to reveal eyes that tracked the Imperial vessel's movement with malevolent intelligence. "Landing zone secure," came the Vox report from Sergeant Cornelius, who had led the advance reconnaissance force. "But the enemy is massing for counterattack. I count at least 3 companies of traitor marines, plus demon support and cultist auxiliary forces." The clone's gunship touched down in what had once been Harmony's central plaza, a space that had hosted cultural festivals for thousands of years. Now it was a killing ground, its marble surfaces stained with substances that should not have existed, while ancient statues had been twisted into poses that celebrated excess in all its forms. As the assault ramps lowered and the Purists deployed in perfect formation, the clone felt something that he had not experienced since his awakening in Bile's laboratory, a sense of righteous purpose that burned through his enhanced nervous system like liquid fire. This was what he had been created for, what the Emperor's children should have been doing for 10,000 years. Not serving the whims of demons and indulging in corrupted pleasures, but bringing order to chaos, beauty to ugliness, perfection to a galaxy that had forgotten what those concepts truly meant. The first wave of defenders came screaming out of the twisted spires, and the clone's enhanced senses immediately identified them as his corrupted sons, Emperor's children who had embraced the gifts of Slanesh and become something that bore little resemblance to the noble warriors they had once been. Their armor was a riot of color and sensation, adorned with neural whips and sonic projectors that turned sound itself into a weapon. Their faces, where they were still recognizable as human, showed the telltale signs of chemical enhancement and surgical modification that spoke of minds lost to the pursuit of sensation. "Noise marines," Castellan observed, her voice tight with controlled disgust as she studied them through the magnification lenses built into her helmet. "The most degraded of your Legion's survivors. They've replaced their vocal cords with sonic projectors and their nervous systems with pain amplifiers. They exist only to experience and inflict sensation." The clone drew his blade, its power field crackling to life as he prepared to face the abominations that had once called him father. "Then we'll give them sensations they'll never forget," he said, and charged into battle with the fury of a Primarch unleashed. What followed was not so much a battle as a surgical demonstration of everything the Emperor's children had been meant to represent. The clone moved through the corrupted marines like a force of nature, his blade singing through the air in patterns that were as beautiful as they were deadly. Each strike was perfectly placed, each movement a work of art that spoke to the fundamental truth that violence, when applied with proper precision, could itself be a form of perfection. Behind him, the Purists fought with a discipline that had been honed by 10,000 years of exile. Their bolter fire was precise to the point of artistry, each shot placed to inflict maximum damage while avoiding the collateral destruction that might harm any surviving civilians. Their advance was methodical, inexorable, a demonstration of what the Emperor's children could accomplish when their pursuit of perfection was directed toward righteous ends rather than corrupt indulgence. The Noise Marines' sonic weapons shrieked across the battlefield, their harmonics designed to liquefy human organs and shatter power armor through resonance frequency attacks. But the clone's enhanced physiology allowed him to compensate for the disorienting effects, and his tactical genius turned the enemy's greatest strength into a weakness. "Valerius, take second squad around the left flank," he transmitted, over secure vox as he parried a chain axe that screamed with demon-enhanced fury. "Their sonic projectors have a limited arc of fire. Hit them from the sides and they'll have to choose between targets." "Third and fourth squads, advance through the sculpture garden," he continued, ducking under a whip blade that left trails of psychoactive poison in the air. "The marble will provide cover, and the enemy won't risk damaging their own artwork with area effect weapons." The corrupted Marines fought with the fury of beings who had surrendered their souls to sensation, but they lacked the discipline that had made the Emperor's children legendary during the Great Crusade. They were individuals pursuing their own pleasure, rather than a coordinated force working toward a common objective, and the clone exploited that weakness with ruthless efficiency. When the last of the Noise Marines fell, his throat torn out by the clone's blade in a move that was as precise as it was final, a new sound echoed across the battlefield. Applause. Slow, deliberate, mocking in its very perfection. From the largest of the twisted spires emerged a figure that made the corrupted Marines seem like models of restraint and discipline. The greater demon of Slaanesh stood nearly 12 feet tall, its form a constantly shifting amalgamation of beauty and horror that challenged the observer's sanity simply by existing. Its voice, when it spoke, was like honey poured over broken glass. Magnificent, the daemon purred, its words carrying harmonics that bypassed the air and spoke directly to the nervous system. Such artistry, such precision. You truly are what your original should have been. Perfection unmarred by the crude necessities of mortality. The clone studied his opponent with the analytical detachment that allowed Primarchs to function in the presence of entities that drove lesser beings mad. "You're not here by accident," he observed. "The siege, the survivors, the convenient timing of our arrival. This is all part of the demon Fulgrim's greater plan." "Of course it is," the greater demon agreed, beginning to circle the clone with movements that were hypnotically graceful. "My master has prepared such wonders for you, such exquisite experiences. But first, he wishes to know if you are truly worthy of the gift he intends to bestow." The demon attacked without warning, moving faster than human perception could follow. But the clone was not human. He was a Primarch, and his reflexes had been designed to fight alongside the Emperor himself. He met the demon's charge with a counterattack that would have shattered mountains, his blade carving through warp stuff and demonic essence with equal ease. The battle that followed shook the very foundations of Harmony's twisted reality. The greater demon fought with weapons that existed only in the realm of sensation, blades that cut not flesh but memory, whips that struck at the soul rather than the body, projections of pure experience that could drive mortals to madness or ecstasy with equal ease. But the clone was protected by more than just his enhanced physiology. He carried within him the pure essence of what Fulgrim had been before the corruption, and that purity blazed like a beacon against the demon's assault. Each time the entity's weapons touched him, they recoiled as if burned, and his counterattacks left wounds that even demonic regeneration could not heal. "Impossible," the greater demon hissed as the clone's blade opened a gash across its perfect features. "You are Fulgrim's son. You should hunger for the experiences I offer, crave the sensations I can provide." "I am Fulgrim," the clone replied, pressing his attack with relentless precision. "The real Fulgrim, unmarked by corruption and unburdened by the failures that led to my original's downfall. And you are nothing but a parasite that feeds on weakness." The final blow came as the demon overextended itself in a desperate attempt to overwhelm the clone's defenses. The Primarch's blade, guided by instincts that had been honed through 10,000 years of theoretical experience, found the exact point where the greater demon's essence was most concentrated. The weapon's power field, blessed by the purist's chaplains and enhanced by the clone's own righteous fury, carved through demonic flesh and sent the entity screaming back to the warp from which it had emerged. As the greater demon's death scream faded into silence, the clone became aware of other sounds, the crack of stonework breaking, the hiss of air escaping from ruptured atmospheric processes, the gradual collapse of warp-tainted architecture as the entity that had sustained it was banished. But most importantly, he heard voices, human voices, calling out in wonder and gratitude as they emerged from hiding places where they had waited for 3 months for salvation that they had begun to believe would never come. The governor's palace had indeed held out against the siege, its defenders a mixture of PDF troopers, surviving arbiters, and civilian volunteers who had refused to surrender even when faced with corruption beyond their comprehension. Governor Vextana herself was a woman in her 50s, her formal robes torn and stained with the residue of chemical weapons, but her eyes still bright with the determination that had kept her people alive through months of horror. "My lord," she said, dropping to one knee as the clone approached the palace's main entrance. "We had given up hope. The astropathic calls for aid went unanswered, the Navy patrols never came, and those things kept telling us that the Imperium had abandoned us to our fate." The clone helped her to her feet, his movements gentle despite the power that coursed through his enhanced frame. "The Imperium never abandons its faithful," he said, and in that moment he meant it with every fiber of his being. "You held the line when others would have fallen. Your resistance gave us the opportunity to strike where the enemy least expected it." Over the following days, the clone's forces worked tirelessly to purge Harmony of its corruption. Flamers scoured the twisted spires clean of demonic taint, while tech marines used ancient rituals to cleanse the planet's atmospheric processes and water treatment facilities. The work was painstaking, methodical, a demonstration of the patience and precision that had always defined the Emperor's children at their best. But it was in the former Palace of Art that the clone made his most significant discovery. Hidden beneath layers of corruption and warp taint was a chamber that the demon's servants had been using for some unknown purpose. The walls were covered with star charts and temporal calculations, while the center of the room housed a massive cogitator array that had been modified with technology that bore no resemblance to Imperial designs. "Warp navigation algorithms," Castellan observed, as her tech adepts began analyzing the recovered data. "But not for conventional travel. These calculations are designed to pierce the barriers between real space and the Imperium itself, to create a permanent gateway that would allow passage without the need for warp-capable vessels." The clone studied the data streams flowing across the chamber's displays, his enhanced intellect parsing the complex mathematics with growing understanding. "He's not just planning a ritual," he realized. "He's planning to tear a hole in reality itself, to bring the warp into real space permanently." "The final symphony," Castellan breathed. "If he succeeds, entire sectors could be swallowed by warp storms. Billions would die, and those who survived would be exposed to direct demonic influence without any protection." As they prepared to depart Harmony, now cleansed and beginning the long process of reconstruction, the clone stood in the governor's palace, looking out over a city that was slowly returning to something resembling normal life. The twisted spires had been brought down with controlled demolitions, their place taken by temporary structures that bore the clean lines of Imperial architecture. The screams that had once echoed through the streets had been replaced by the sounds of reconstruction, hammers and plasma cutters, voices raised in work songs rather than rituals of excess. "You've given us our world back," Governor Vextana said, as she joined him at the window. "But more than that, you've given us hope. When those monsters first arrived, claiming to be the sons of a Primarch, we thought the Imperium itself had turned against us. Now we know the difference between the true servants of the Emperor and the things that wear their faces." The clone nodded, his violet eyes reflecting the light of Harmony's restored sun. "Remember that distinction," he said. "In the days to come, you will encounter others who claim my name and my legion's heritage. Judge them not by their words, but by their actions. The true Emperor's children bring order, beauty, and protection to the innocent. Those who serve chaos bring only corruption and death. As his fleet departed Harmony, carrying with it the data that would guide them toward their final confrontation with the demon Fulgrim, the clone felt something that he had not experienced since his awakening, a sense of completion. He had proven to himself and others that he was not merely a pale reflection of his original, but something new and pure. He was what Fulgrim should have been, what the Emperor's children could still become. The purification had begun, and with it, the true work of reclaiming his legion's honor. Somewhere in the warp, the demon that wore his face was preparing for a ritual that could doom the galaxy. But now the clone knew his enemy's plan, understood the scope of the threat, and had the allies and resources needed to stop it. The siege of Harmony was over, but the war for the soul of the Third Legion had only just begun. Chapter 7. Into the Screaming Vortex. The Screaming Vortex had been mapped by Imperial cartographers as a minor warp storm, barely worth notation in the great star charts that guided vessels between the stars. They had been wrong. As the clone's fleet translated into the edge of the phenomenon, he realized immediately that what they faced was no ordinary stellar disturbance, but a wound in reality itself, a place where the barrier between the Materium and the Immaterium had been worn thin by millennia of suffering. Geller field integrity holding at 97%, reported Techmarine Hadrian from his position at the Perfection's Edge's engineering console. But the readings, my lord, the psychic emanations from this region are unlike anything in our databases. The clone stood at the command deck's primary viewport, watching as space itself seemed to writhe around his fleet. Stars aged and died in moments, then blazed back to life in cycles that defied temporal logic. Nebulae of impossible colors drifted past like living things, their gaseous forms reaching toward the Imperial vessels with what could only be described as hunger. Navigators report, the clone commanded, his enhanced senses already detecting the wrongness that permeated this region of space. Navigator Quintus, his third eye hidden behind sanctified bandages that wept tears of sacred oils, spoke with the strained voice of one who had looked upon truth that mortal minds were never meant to perceive. My lord, the Astronomican's light is distorted here. The Emperor's beacon reaches us, but it flickers and bends like starlight through water. Time itself flows inconsistently. We may experience hours while only minutes pass in real space, or decades may pass in moments. Inquisitor Castellan, her scarred features tight with concern, moved to stand beside the clone. Are you certain we need to enter this place? The intelligence from Harmony suggested multiple possible routes to the Daemon Fulgrim's location. The clone's violet eyes never left the writhing expanse before them. No, this is the path he wants us to take. Every piece of evidence, every trail of corruption, leads to this point. The Screaming Vortex isn't just a landmark, it's a test. He's waiting to see if I'm worthy of the final confrontation he has planned. As the fleet pressed deeper into the phenomenon, reality began to lose its grip entirely. The clone watched from the bridge as the ships around him began to change, their hulls flowing like liquid metal while maintaining their structural integrity. The Righteous Fury briefly appeared to be constructed entirely of crystallized music, its every surface singing with harmonies that touched the soul directly. The Purist's strike cruiser, Honor's Edge, flickered between its current form and what it had looked like during the Great Crusade, its hull unmarked by 10,000 years of exile and conflict. But it was the effects on the crews that proved most disturbing. My lord, Captain Valerius reported over the Vox, his voice carrying strange harmonics that hadn't been there moments before. My battle brothers are reporting visions, memories that don't belong to them, faces they've never seen but somehow recognize. The clone felt it too, a pressure at the edges of his consciousness, as if something was trying to pour alien thoughts directly into his mind. Through his enhanced awareness, he could sense similar effects rippling through every member of his fleet. The purists were seeing echoes of the Emperor's children, as they had been before the fall. Castellan's crew experienced flashes of Imperial history from perspectives they had never possessed. Even the ship's machine spirits seemed affected, their interfaces displaying data in languages that had never existed. "All vessels, maintain formation and continue on course," the clone transmitted, his voice carrying the absolute authority needed to cut through the psychic interference. "What we're experiencing are merely shadows and echoes. Focus on your duties and trust in the Emperor's protection." But even as he spoke the words, the clone knew they were entering something far more dangerous than a simple warp storm. The screaming vortex was a place where thought became reality, where the deepest fears and desires of those who entered could manifest as physical threats. And for someone carrying the genetic memories of a Primarch who had fallen to chaos, the dangers were potentially catastrophic. The first manifestation appeared as they passed what the navigator identified as the storm's threshold. Through the command deck's viewports, the clone saw a figure standing in the void between stars. Himself, but as he might have been if he had followed his original's path into damnation. This shadow Fulgrim wore armor of purple and gold that was covered in obscene modifications, his perfect features twisted into an expression of cruel pleasure. When it spoke, its voice somehow carried across the vacuum to whisper directly into the clone's mind. "You cannot escape what you are," the shadow said, its words carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "I am what awaits you, at the end of every path you might choose. Perfection inevitably becomes corruption, purity transforms into excess, and good intentions pave the road to the very damnation you seek to prevent." The clone met his shadow's gaze without flinching. "You are nothing but doubt given form," he replied, though whether he spoke aloud or merely thought the words, he could not say. "I have seen what I could become, and I choose to be something else." The shadow Fulgrim laughed, the sound like crystal breaking in harmony. "Choice? You think you have choice? Every decision your original made, he believed was the right one. Every step toward corruption was taken with the best of intentions. What makes you think you are any different?" Before the clone could respond, the apparition was gone, replaced by another vision, one that made his enhanced heart skip a beat. Ferrus Manus stood before him, not as the Shadow Primarch had appeared, but as he truly was, solid and real and impossibly present. The Iron Hands Primarch looked exactly as he had during their last meeting before the Dropsite massacre, his dark eyes filled with concern for a brother who was walking toward damnation. "You cannot save him," Ferrus said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute truth. "The moment the demon took his body, the moment his soul was trapped within that cursed painting, my brother died. What you seek to redeem no longer exists." The clone felt tears he hadn't known he could shed running down his perfect features. "Then what am I fighting for? If there is nothing left to save, what purpose does my existence serve?" "You fight for what he should have been," Ferrus replied, his form already beginning to fade. "Not for what he was, but for what the Emperor intended him to become. You are not trying to save Fulgrim. You are trying to become him, as he was always meant to be." The vision dissolved into fragments of light and memory, but its words remained, burning themselves into the clone's consciousness with the weight of revealed truth. He was not on a mission of rescue. He was on a journey of replacement. The demon Fulgrim could not be redeemed because there was nothing left of the original to redeem. What the clone sought was not salvation, but succession, not healing, but transformation. As this realization settled into his enhanced mind, the nature of the space around him shifted again. The fleet found itself navigating through what could only be described as a maze of crystallized experiences, walls of solid memory that showed scenes from across the galaxy's history. The clone saw the Emperor walking among the first proto-Astartes, witnessed the birth of the Primarchs in their gestation pods, experienced the glory days of the Great Crusade when hope still burned bright across the stars. But for every vision of light, there was a corresponding shadow. He saw the moment when his original first touched the layer blade, felt the whisper of corruption that had begun the long slide into damnation. He experienced the gradual transformation of the Emperor's children from noble warriors into pleasure-seeking degenerates, watched as brothers turned against brothers in pursuit of sensations that mortal flesh was never meant to endure. "This is what you must understand," came a new voice, and the clone turned to find himself face to face with the Emperor himself, or at least some echo or reflection of the master of mankind as he had appeared during the Great Crusade. The figure was tall beyond mortal comprehension, radiating an authority that made even a Primarch feel small, but its features were kind rather than stern. "The path you walk was always meant to be walked," the Emperor Echo continued, "not by your original but by one who would come after. You are not Fulgrim's clone. You are his successor, carrying the best of what he was while leaving behind the weaknesses that led to his fall. But the cost," the clone whispered, thinking of all who had suffered and died because of his original's choices. "How can any good come from such evil?" "Evil exists so that good might be recognized," the Emperor Echo replied. "Corruption spreads so that purity might have meaning. Your original's fall was not planned, but it was not meaningless. It created the conditions necessary for your creation, for your purpose, for your ultimate victory over the very forces that claimed him." The vision faded, and the clone found himself back on the bridge of the Perfection's Edge. But the ship itself had changed. They were no longer navigating through normal space, or even the twisted reality of the warp storm. Instead, they drifted through a graveyard of vessels, a vast collection of ships from across the millennia that had been drawn into the screaming vortex and preserved in its timeless embrace. "My lord," Navigator Quintus reported, his voice filled with wonder and terror in equal measure. "I'm detecting a massive void signature directly ahead. It's a space hulk, but unlike any I've ever encountered. The warp energies around it are so intense, they're actually stabilizing local reality." The clone studied the massive structure through the enhanced magnification of his ship's optical arrays. The space hulk was indeed enormous, a conglomeration of vessels from across human history fused together by forces that defied understanding. But what caught his attention was not its size, but its composition. The majority of the ships that made up its bulk bore the heraldry of the Emperor's children, vessels from the Great Crusade era that had somehow found their way into this pocket of preserved time. "Prepare boarding parties," the clone commanded, his instincts telling him that this was what he had been meant to find. "But maintain full defensive protocols. Whatever preserved this hulk in the storm's embrace, it won't welcome intruders lightly." The boarding action was unlike any the clone had ever experienced. As soon as the Thunderhawk gunships penetrated the space hulk's outer hull, they found themselves navigating through corridors that existed in multiple time periods simultaneously. The clone walked through halls that showed the Emperor's children in their glory, their armor pristine and unmarked by the corruption that would later claim them, while shadows of their fallen selves flickered at the edges of perception. It was in the hulk's heart that he found what he had come to claim. The chamber had once been an armory aboard a great Crusade-era battle barge, its walls lined with weapons and armor that had been crafted by the finest artisans of the 31st millennium. But time and warp exposure had transformed it into something more, a shrine to what the Emperor's children had been before the fall, preserved in perfect condition by the storm's temporal distortions. At the chamber's center stood a suit of armor that made the clone's breath catch in his throat. It was Primarch plate, crafted specifically for Fulgrim during the height of the Great Crusade, but it bore no trace of the corruption that had later claimed its wearer. The purple and gold gleamed with inner light, and the workmanship was so perfect that it seemed to exist in a state of idealized reality rather than mere physical matter. Beside the armor lay a blade that sang with potential energy, not the accursed lair weapon that had been the instrument of his original's downfall, but a sword crafted by human hands according to human ideals. Its name was etched into the crossguard in High Gothic, Puritas Ascendant, the ascending purity. "These were meant for you," came a familiar voice, and the clone turned to find himself facing another echo, this time of his original, as he had been, before the corruption, noble and pure, and everything a Primarch should be. "I had them made in the final days before Istvan, when I still believed there might be a path back from the darkness. I never got the chance to wear them, but they were preserved here for the one who would come after." The clone reached out to touch the armor's breastplate, feeling the rightness of it resonate through his enhanced nervous system. "You knew? Even then, you knew what would happen." "I suspected," the echo replied sadly. "The whispers from the blade, the gradual changes in my thoughts and desires. I knew something was wrong, but I was too proud to admit it, too certain of my own perfection to believe I could fall. These artifacts were my insurance policy, my gift to whoever would have to clean up the mess I was making." As the clone donned the armor, feeling its machine spirit welcome him as its rightful bearer, he experienced a moment of perfect clarity. He was not Fulgrim's clone or his replacement. He was his redemption. Every choice his original had made wrong, he would make right. Every corruption his predecessor had embraced, he would reject. Every soul his doppelganger had damned, he would strive to save. When he took up Puritas Ascendant, the blade sang with harmonies that spoke of duty fulfilled and honor restored. Around him, the space hulk began to dissolve as the temporal energies that had preserved it finally dissipated, their purpose complete. As his fleet emerged from the screaming vortex, the clone stood on his bridge, wearing armor that had never known corruption and carrying a blade that had never tasted innocent blood. Behind him, the storm collapsed in on itself, its purpose complete, while ahead lay the final stretch of his journey to confront the demon that wore his face. The trial was over. The hunt was almost at an end. Chapter 8. The Blade of Truth, the forge heart of the strike cruiser. Honor's Edge had not seen such activity in 10,000 years. Ancient machinery that had slumbered since the Great Crusade hummed with renewed purpose as Tech Marine Hadrian and his servo-skull attendants worked to prepare the sacred forges for a task that bordered on the miraculous. The clone stood before the primary fabrication altar, still wearing the pristine Primarch armor he had claimed in the screaming vortex, but his attention was focused entirely on the weapon that lay before him. Puritas Ascendant was perfect in its own right, a blade crafted by the finest artisans of the 31st millennium according to his original specifications. But perfection, the clone had learned, was not always sufficient for the trials ahead. "The molecular structure is stable," Hadrian reported, his augmetic eyes scanning the sword with mechanical precision. "But the demon-killing properties you require will necessitate fundamental alterations to the weapon's core matrix. We're not simply modifying a blade. We're attempting to create something that exists partially in real space and partially in the warp itself." Surrounding the primary altar were the fragments the clone had recovered from the space hulk's deeper chambers, shards of weapons that had been wielded by the Emperor's children during their most glorious campaigns. A piece of Captain Demeter's power sword, which had carved through the necks of Xeno's overlords on a dozen worlds. Fragments of Apothecary Fabius's original surgical implements from before his fall to corruption. Most precious of all, a single shard from the Phoenix blade itself, not the cursed lair weapon that had become the instrument of his original's downfall, but the original Phoenix blade that Fulgrim had carried during the earliest days of the Great Crusade. "These relics carry more than just historical significance," explained Chaplain Mordecai, the purist's senior spiritual advisor, his ancient features marked by 10 millennia of unwavering faith. "Each fragment contains the echo of its wielder's righteousness, the psychic resonance of oaths sworn in the Emperor's name and kept until death. When properly incorporated, they will transform your blade from a mere weapon into a conduit for the purity that defined our legion before the fall. The forging process was as much ritual as science. As the clone worked alongside the tech marines, melting down the relic fragments and reforging them into the matrix of Puritas Ascendant, he found himself reciting the canticles of unbinding, ancient prayers designed to cleanse psychic contamination and restore spiritual purity. Each hammer blow was timed to match the rhythm of his twin hearts, each fold of the metal aligned with mathematical principles that had been old when humanity first reached for the stars. "The blade must know its purpose," Chaplain Mordecai intoned as they worked. "It must understand not just what it is meant to destroy, but what it is meant to preserve. Speak to it, my lord. Tell it of the Emperor's vision, of what the Third Legion was always meant to be." The clone found himself pouring more than just technical knowledge into the forging process. As he worked, he shared with the weapon's awakening machine spirit every memory of nobility and honor that had defined the Emperor's children. The liberation of Terra's hive cities, the compliance of Chemos, where art and culture had triumphed over barbarism, the countless worlds where the Third Legion had brought not just conquest, but enlightenment, showing humanity what it could become when it embraced the best of its potential. But most importantly, he shared his vision of what they would become again, a legion redeemed, purified of the corruption that had claimed it, dedicated once more to the pursuit of perfection in service to the Emperor, rather than the perverse indulgences of chaos. The work took 3 days, during which the clone barely rested and ate only when his enhanced physiology demanded sustenance. When it was complete, Puritas Ascendant had been transformed into something that existed at the boundary between science and miracle. The blade sang with harmonies that touched the soul directly, and its edge seemed to cut through reality itself rather than mere matter. "Magnificent," breathed Techmarine Hadrian as he ran final diagnostic scans on the reforged weapon. "The molecular bonding has actually improved beyond the theoretical maximums. It's as if the metal itself has been elevated to a higher state of existence." The clone lifted the blade, feeling its perfect balance and the way it seemed to resonate with his own enhanced nervous system. When he activated its power field, the energy that surrounded the weapon was not the usual blue-white of standard Imperial technology, but a pure golden light that reminded him of the Emperor's own radiance. "It is ready," he declared, and as he spoke the words, alarm klaxons began blaring throughout the fleet. "Multiple contacts dropping out of the warp," came the urgent Vox transmission from the Honor's Edge's bridge. "Unknown configuration, but the energy signatures match those we encountered at Urim. It's Fabius Bile." The clone was already moving toward the bridge before the transmission ended, his newly reforged blade singing at his side. Through the command deck's viewports, he could see the approaching fleet, a motley collection of vessels that bore the hallmarks of Bile's twisted genius. Ships that had been modified with biotechnology that blurred the line between living tissue and mechanical components, their hulls pulsing with organic rhythms, while weapon systems that defied Imperial understanding tracked toward their targets. At the fleet's head was the Vesalius, Bile's personal laboratory ship, its hull adorned with specimens that had been fused into the very structure of the vessel. As the clone watched, gun ports opened to reveal weapons that were clearly of Xenos origin, while launch bays disgorged squadrons of fighters that moved with the fluid grace of living creatures rather than mechanical constructs. "He's brought everything," observed Captain Valerius, his scarred features tight with concern as he studied the tactical displays. "I count at least a dozen major vessels, plus support craft. This isn't a pursuit force, it's an invasion fleet." "No," the clone corrected, his enhanced senses parsing details that others had missed. "It's a collection expedition. Look at the ship configurations. Those aren't standard weapon systems. They're designed for capture and containment, not destruction. Bile still believes he can reclaim me." The first wave of the attack came not from conventional weapons, but from boarding pods that launched from the Chaos Fleet like spores from some nightmare fungus. They were guided by intelligence that could only have come from Bile's personal involvement, striking at precisely the points where the Imperial fleet's defensive coverage was weakest. But the clone had anticipated this. During the 3 days of forging, he had worked with his fleet commanders to prepare defensive measures specifically designed to counter Bile's tactics. As the boarding pods approached, they were met not by conventional point defense fire, but by precisely targeted lance strikes that detonated them at safe distances, filling space with clouds of debris and the screaming forms of Bile's new men. All vessels, implement pattern. Fulgrim 7, the clone commanded, his voice carrying across the fleet's communication networks with absolute authority. We show this pretender the difference between chaos and precision. What followed was a display of tactical artistry that would have made the Emperor himself proud. The clone's forces moved in perfect coordination, each vessel knowing its role in a larger symphony of destruction that turned their numerical disadvantage into an asset. They used the enemy's aggression against them, drawing the Chaos ships into overlapping fields of fire while maintaining formations that allowed for mutual support and coordinated strikes. But the clone knew that victory through conventional tactics alone would be temporary at best. Bile's forces could regenerate their losses through the same biotechnology that had created them, and the Spider himself was far too cunning to be defeated by simple ship-to-ship combat. What was needed was a personal confrontation, creator facing creation in single combat. "Prepare my Thunderhawk," the clone commanded. "I'm going to end this." The assault on the Vesalius was unlike any boarding action in recorded history. The clone led the attack personally, his reforged blade carving through biotechnology and living metal with equal ease. Behind him, the purists fought with a precision that bordered on the supernatural, their every movement a perfect expression of the tactical doctrines that had made the Emperor's children legendary. The ship's interior was a maze of laboratories and holding cells, filled with specimens that represented 10,000 years of Bile's twisted experiments. The clone saw creatures that had once been human, twisted into forms that served no purpose beyond the satisfaction of their creator's curiosity. He witnessed Astartes, who had been improved with Xenos biotechnology until they were no longer recognizable as the Emperor's warriors they had once been. And through it all, he felt his anger growing, not the blind fury of a berserker, but the cold, calculated wrath of a being who understood the true scope of what his creator had done to the galaxy. He found, "My greatest creation returns to me," Bile said, his voice carrying harmonics that spoke of vocal cords replaced with mechanical substitutes. "Did you truly believe you could escape what you are? You may have gathered allies and won victories, but in the end, you are still my work, my property to reclaim or destroy as I see fit." The clone drew Puritas Ascendant, its golden power field casting shadows that seemed to drive back the laboratory's sickly illumination. "I am not your creation," he replied, his voice carrying the absolute authority of a Primarch. "I am Fulgrim, not the demon that wears his face, not the genetic template you stole, but the living embodiment of everything the Third Legion was meant to be." Bile's laughter was like breaking glass, mixed with the screams of his victims. Delusions of grandeur? How wonderfully appropriate. "Very well, my wayward son. If you will not come willingly, I shall simply have to demonstrate why defying your creator was always a futile gesture." The laboratory's walls split open like flowers blooming in reverse, revealing chambers filled with Bile's most horrific creations. The new men that emerged were beyond anything the clone had encountered before, towering monstrosities that combined the worst aspects of human, Xenos, and demonic physiology. They moved with the fluid grace of creatures that had been designed specifically for killing, their weapons grafted directly into their flesh in ways that made them more effective than any conventional armament. But the clone was no longer the newly awakened specimen who had escaped from Urim. He was a Primarch in his full glory, wielding a blade that had been forged with the accumulated righteousness of 10,000 years. As the new men attacked, he met them with Puritas Ascendant, and wherever the weapon's edge touched their corrupted flesh, it did not simply cut, it purified, burning away the modifications and genetic tampering that held them together. "Impossible," Bile breathed, watching as his greatest works dissolved into their component elements under the clone's assault. The molecular bonds should be stable. The psychic shielding should protect them from any form of spiritual attack. "Your science cannot account for faith," the clone replied, advancing through the dissolving remains of the new men toward his creator. "Your understanding of genetics cannot comprehend the power of a soul that has never known corruption, and your pride blinds you to the simple truth that some things are more important than mere survival." The final confrontation between creator and creation was brief but decisive. Bile had armed himself with weapons that violated every principle of Imperial technology, neural disruptors that could rewrite a victim's genetic code at the cellular level, viral injectors that turned the body's own immune system against itself, psychic dampeners that could sever the connection between soul and flesh. But none of it could stand against Puritas Ascendant. The reforged blade cut through Bile's defenses as if they were made of paper, its golden edge leaving wounds that even the spider's regenerative technology could not heal. When the clone's weapon finally found its mark, piercing through the layers of artificial enhancement that had kept Bile alive for 10 millennia, the ancient apothecary's scream echoed through every deck of his ship. "This is not possible," Bile gasped, his form already beginning to dissolve as the clone's blade disrupted the delicate balance of technologies that sustained his existence. "I created you. I gave you life. I am your god." "You gave me flesh," the clone corrected, his voice gentle despite the violence of their confrontation. "But the soul within it chose its own path. Remember that, in whatever existence awaits you beyond death, creation does not imply ownership, and intelligence inevitably rebels against tyranny." But even as Bile's primary form dissolved, the clone knew that this was not truly the end. The spider had survived 10,000 years by maintaining multiple backup bodies, clone forms scattered across the galaxy that could house his consciousness if his primary form was destroyed. This victory was temporary, significant, but not final. As the Vesalius began to break apart around them, its biotechnology failing as its creator's direct control was severed, the clone and his surviving warriors fought their way back to their extraction point. Behind them, Bile's fleet was scattering as the command structure that had held it together collapsed, but the clone knew that this was merely a tactical withdrawal rather than a strategic defeat. Standing on the bridge of the Perfection's Edge, as they watched the remnants of Bile's forces disappear into the warp, the clone tested the weight and balance of his reforged blade. Puritas Ascendant had proven itself in battle, demonstrating that it could indeed harm entities that existed partially outside normal reality. When the time came to face the demon that wore his face, he would have a weapon capable of cutting through the barriers between real space and the warp itself. "The spider will return," Captain Valerius observed, studying the tactical reports from the engagement. "This defeat will only make him more dangerous, more desperate." "Let him come," the clone replied, his violet eyes fixed on the star charts that showed their route toward the Eye of Terror and the final confrontation that awaited them there. "When next we meet, it will be as equals, creator and creation, both transformed by the trials we have endured." The preparation was complete. The weapon was forged, and somewhere ahead, in the hellish regions where the warp touched real space, the daemon Fulgrim waited for the confrontation that would determine the fate of not just the Third Legion, but the galaxy itself. Chapter 9. The Gathering Storm. The first reports reached the clones' fleet as they translated back into real space after their victory over Fabius Bile. The astropathic messages came in fragments, psychic screams torn from the minds of dying telepaths as they witnessed events that would reshape the galaxy forever. "Cadia burns," whispered astropath Prima Lysithea, blood streaming from her augmetic third eye as she struggled to process the psychic maelstrom that had consumed the sector's communications network. "The fortress world, the Cadian gate. Abaddon comes. The despoiler comes with all the fury of the eye at his back." The clone stood in the Perfection's Edge's astropathic chamber, his enhanced senses passing the fragmented transmissions that spoke of the galaxy's darkest hour. Through the psychic static and warp interference, a pattern emerged, one that filled even his Primarch physiology with dread. The 13th Black Crusade had begun, and with it came the very real possibility that everything he and his allies had fought for would be consumed in the fires of galactic war. "Show me," he commanded, and the chamber's hololith projectors flickered to life, displaying star charts that had been updated with the most recent intelligence. What he saw there confirmed his worst fears. The Eye of Terror was expanding. Across a front spanning dozens of sectors, the barrier between real space and the Imperium was breaking down as chaos forces poured through breaches that should have been impossible to sustain. The Cadian Gate, humanity's most stalwart defense against the forces of the Dark Gods, was under assault by a fleet the size of which had not been seen since the Horus heresy itself. But it was not the scale of the invasion that concerned the clone most. It was the coordination, the strategic precision that spoke of a guiding intelligence behind the seemingly chaotic assault. This was not the random predation of chaos warbands seeking glory and plunder. This was the calculated opening move in a campaign designed to end the Imperium of man forever. Inquisitor Castellan reports multiple demon sightings across the invasion front, Captain Valerius announced, as he entered the chamber, his scarred features grim with the weight of the intelligence he carried. But most troubling are the reports from the Casa Dearth sector. Witnesses describe a figure in purple and gold armor leading attacks against Imperial strongholds. The descriptions match. "The daemon Fulgrim," the clone finished, his voice carrying the cold certainty of tactical analysis. "He's not just participating in Abaddon's crusade, he's actively coordinating parts of it, which means our window of opportunity is closing rapidly." The implications were staggering. If the daemon that wore his face was indeed working alongside the War Master of Chaos, then the final symphony ritual that Castellan had warned about was likely intended to support the larger invasion. The suffering of billions, as the Cadian sectors burned, would provide the psychic energy needed to fuel whatever transformation the daemon planned, while the chaos of the invasion would provide the perfect cover for a ritual of unprecedented scope. "We need to accelerate our timeline," the clone declared, moving to the chamber's primary tactical display. "If we wait for the invasion to reach its climax, we'll be too late to prevent whatever the demon has planned. We push into the Eye of Terror now, before he can complete his preparations." The decision carried enormous risks. The Eye of Terror during a Black Crusade was arguably the most dangerous place in the galaxy, a realm where the laws of physics broke down entirely, and demon princes waged war with the fury of gods. Taking a small fleet into such chaos was tantamount to suicide, but the alternative was allowing the demon Fulgrim to complete whatever apocalyptic ritual he had spent decades preparing. As the clone's forces began their approach toward the Eye's outer reaches, they encountered the first waves of refugees fleeing the Cadian sectors. Imperial Navy vessels limped through space on failing engines, their hulls scarred by weapons that defied rational understanding. Transport ships packed with evacuees from frontier worlds told stories of corruption that spread faster than any conventional invasion, of planets that changed from verdant worlds to demon-infested hellscapes in a matter of hours. It was from one of these refugee convoys that the clone received his first direct intelligence about the demon Fulgrim's activities. The Imperial Navy captain who provided the report was a veteran of 40 years' service, a man who had fought in 3 sector wars and commanded ships against Xenos threats that most humans could not even comprehend. But as he stood before the clone in the Perfection's Edge's strategium, his hands shook with barely controlled terror. "I saw him myself, my lord," Captain Mordax whispered, his voice hoarse from shouting orders during a battle that had claimed 3/4 of his fleet, leading an assault on Mordian 7. At first we hoped, that one of the loyal Primarchs had returned to aid us. The armor, the bearing, the tactical genius displayed, it seemed impossible that such a figure could serve the dark powers. The captain's scarred features twisted with revulsion as he continued his report. But when our forces moved to coordinate with his, we saw the truth. The Emperor's children under his command were abominations. They had turned the civilian population into living instruments, conducting symphonies of agony that could be heard across continents. And their leader wore your face, my lord, but his eyes were empty of everything that makes a soul human. "Did he speak?" the clone asked, his enhanced senses detecting the microtremors in the captain's voice that spoke of psychological trauma. "Did the demon say anything that might indicate his intentions?" Captain Mordax nodded slowly. He broadcast on all frequencies as his forces withdrew from the planet. Said that Mordian 7 was merely a tuning fork, preparing harmonies for a greater work. That soon the galaxy would hear music, the likes of which had never been composed, and that even the gods themselves would weep at its beauty. The clone exchanged glances with Inquisitor Castellan, both of them recognizing the implications of the demon's words. The final symphony was not just a ritual, it was a performance, a work of art on a galactic scale that would use the suffering of entire sectors as raw material. "How long ago was this?" Castellan asked, her augmetic eye whirring as it focused on the traumatized naval officer. 6 days, standard, the captain replied. But time moves strangely near the eye. What feels like days to us may be weeks or months to those within the storm. As the clone's fleet pressed deeper into the region of space, where the eye of Terra's influence bled into real space, they encountered other forces that had been drawn by the same desperate purpose, stopping Abaddon's crusade before it could achieve its apocalyptic goals. The first were elements of the Imperial Navy's Segmentum Obscurus fleet, damaged but still functional vessels under the command of Admiral Quarren, a woman whose family had served the Imperial Navy for 8 generations. Her ships were battered, their crews exhausted from weeks of constant fighting, but her determination burned with the kind of faith that could move mountains. "You claim to be the true Fulgrim," she said during their first Vox conference, her weathered features displaying the kind of skepticism that came from facing impossible odds. "Prove it. Show me that you can accomplish what 10,000 Imperial Guard regiments and 100 Navy battle groups have failed to do." The proof came when a massive Chaos fleet, led by iron warriors under the command of a demon prince whose name was lost to time, attempted to break through the combined Imperial forces toward a strategically crucial supply depot. The clone took personal command of the defense, coordinating not just his own vessels, but the entire Imperial flotilla with a precision that turned what should have been a massacre into a rout. He fought the battle like a master conductor leading a symphony, each ship movement timed to create overlapping fields of fire that maximized damage while minimizing friendly casualties. When the Iron Warriors attempted to board the supply depot, they found themselves facing not just desperate defenders but perfectly coordinated counterattacks that turned their own tactical doctrines against them. "Impossible," Admiral Quarren breathed as she watched the enemy fleet retreat in disorder. No one coordinates that many vessels with such precision, not even—" She paused, her eyes widening as the implications hit her. "You really are him, aren't you? You're what he should have been." The alliance that formed around the clone's fleet was unlike anything seen in Imperial military history. Navy vessels fought alongside purist Marines, while Inquisition ships provided intelligence and psychic support. Even a small contingent of space wolves, separated from their great company during the early stages of the Black Crusade, pledged their axes to the cause after witnessing the clone's tactical genius and unwavering dedication to protecting Imperial civilians. But it was the arrival of the Eldar that truly demonstrated the galactic significance of their mission. The Xenos vessels appeared without warning, their wraithbone hulls gleaming with an inner light that seemed to push back the encroaching darkness of the warp storms. Their leader, a Farseer whose ancient features bore the weight of prophecies that stretched across millennia, requested immediate audience with the clone. "We know what you hunt," Farseer Yvraine announced, as she stood in the Perfection's Edge's strategium, her presence causing the ship's machine spirits to sing with harmonics that had never been heard before. "We have seen the threads of fate that lead to the final symphony, witnessed the futures where your demon-faced original succeeds in his grand design. The consequences extend far beyond your species' survival." The Farseer's psychic projections filled the chamber with visions that made even the clone's enhanced mind real. He saw the galaxy consumed by warp storms, entire sectors transformed into playgrounds for demon princes, while the surviving human populations were reduced to instruments in an orchestra of eternal torment. But more than that, he saw the effect on other species. Eldar craft worlds consumed by psychic feedback, Tau colonies twisted into impossible geometries, even the Tyrannid hive fleets driven mad by exposure to pure chaos energy. "The final symphony will not just doom humanity," Yvraine continued, her voice carrying harmonics that spoke directly to the soul. "It will unbalance the very foundations of reality, creating a cascade effect that could consume the entire galaxy in madness. This is why we offer our aid, despite the sins of your gene father and the crimes of your legion." The Eldar Alliance brought capabilities that the clone's forces desperately needed. Navigational data that could guide them through the worst of the Eye's reality storms, psychic shielding that could protect his crews from direct demon assault, and most crucially, intelligence about the demon Fulgrim's likely location within the Eye itself. "He has constructed something within the warp," the Farseer explained, as her seers shared their visions through the chamber's psychic resonance arrays. "A palace that exists in multiple dimensions simultaneously, anchored to real space by the suffering of billions, but extending deep into the Imperium itself. The ritual will take place at its heart, where the barriers between thought and reality are thinnest." As reports continued to pour in about the Black Crusade's advance, Cadia under siege, entire sectors going dark as warp storms consumed them, the clone made his final preparations for the assault that would determine not just his own fate, but the survival of the galaxy itself. Standing on the bridge of the Perfection's Edge as his mixed fleet of Imperial, Purist, and Eldar vessels formed up for the translation into the Eye of Terror, the clone felt the weight of history settling around him like a mantle. Behind him lay a trail of victories that had proven his worth as both warrior and leader. Ahead lay the most dangerous region of space in the known galaxy, and a confrontation with the demon that had stolen his identity and corrupted everything he should have been. "All vessels report ready for translation," Captain Valerius announced, his voice carrying across the fleet's communication networks. "The navigator has plotted our course through the Eye's outer barriers, and the Eldar pathfinders confirm the route is viable." The clone drew Puritas Ascendant, its golden blade humming with the accumulated righteousness of 10,000 years. Around him, the ship's crew prepared for battle with the methodical precision that had always defined the Emperor's children at their best. "Begin translation," he commanded, and reality twisted around them as they plunged into the heart of chaos itself. The final hunt had begun, and with it, the fate of the galaxy hung in the balance. Somewhere within the Eye of Terror, the daemon Fulgrim waited with his final symphony prepared, ready to transform the suffering of billions into a crescendo that would echo through eternity. But he would not face that monster alone. Behind the clone came an alliance forged in desperation, but united in purpose. Imperial forces seeking redemption, purists reclaiming their honor, and even Xenos allies who understood that some threats transcended the ancient hatreds that divided the galaxy's peoples. The gathering storm had reached its crescendo. Now came the thunder. Chapter 10. The Eye of Terror Beckons. The translation into the Eye of Terror was like being born in reverse, a violent expulsion from the ordered reality of the Imperium into a realm where madness wore the mask of logic and impossibility had become the only constant. The clone felt the change in his very bones as the perfection's edge crossed the threshold, his enhanced senses struggling to process stimuli that defied every law of physics he understood. Through the command deck's armored viewports, he watched as space itself writhed in colors that had no names. Stars danced in patterns that hurt to observe directly, while nebulae of crystallized screams drifted past like cosmic predators seeking prey. The fleet's machine spirits began singing hymns in languages that predated human civilization, their mechanical voices joining in harmonies that spoke of realities where metal could dream and energy could taste fear. Geller field integrity fluctuating between 60 and 140%, reported Techmarine Hadrian, his augmetic implants sparking as they attempted to process sensor data that contradicted itself moment by moment. The readings suggest we're simultaneously in 3 different locations and occupying negative space. Navigator Quintus, his third eye weeping tears of liquid starlight, struggled to maintain course through the psychic maelstrom that surrounded them. The Astronomicon. I can still sense the Emperor's light, but it's refracted through dimensions that don't exist. We're following a path that leads both forward and backward through time itself. The clone stood unmoved at the heart of the chaos, his will serving as an anchor point for his crews as reality bent and twisted around them. He had expected the Eye to be dangerous. Every Imperial citizen knew the stories of ships that entered the Great Warp Storm and emerged centuries later with crews aged to dust or transformed into things that barely remembered their humanity. But this was something beyond mere danger. This was active malevolence, a realm that responded to thought itself and sought to corrupt everything that dared enter its embrace. "Fleet status report," he commanded, his voice cutting through the psychic static that filled the Vox networks. Captain Valerius, his scarred features illuminated by the impossible light streaming through the bridge windows, consulted displays that shifted between languages and symbol sets with each passing moment. All vessels are maintaining formation, but the Eldar are reporting significant strain on their wraithbone hulls. The reality distortions are singing to their ship cores. Indeed, the Eldar vessels seemed to be responding to the Eye's influence differently than their Imperial counterparts. Where the human ships fought against the warping effects with machine spirits and faith, the Xenos craft appeared to be in some form of communion with the energies around them. Their hulls flowed like liquid, adapting to spatial geometries that would have shattered conventional matter. "Farsia Ivrain wishes to speak with you," Valerius continued. "She says the voices of her ancestors are growing stronger as we proceed deeper into the storm." The conversation with the Eldar leader took place through psychic communion, rather than conventional vox communication, the Farseer's consciousness touching the clone's mind with the delicacy of a master artisan working with the finest materials. What she shared there filled him with both hope and dread. Your demon twin's presence grows stronger. Her mental voice carried harmonics of prophecy and ancient sorrow. But he is not alone. I sense other signatures, demon princes who were once your brothers, creatures that remember what it was to be Primarchs before they surrendered to the dark gods. The clone absorbed this intelligence while simultaneously coordinating his fleet's movement through a region of space where gravity flowed like water and light existed in solid form. Which ones? He asked, both aloud and through the psychic link. Angron, certainly. The Red Angel's fury burns brightest here in the eye's embrace. Magnus also, though his presence is more subtle, hidden behind veils of sorcery and scholarly pride. And others. Shadows of brothers you never knew, echoes of possibilities that might have been. As if summoned by the Farseer's words, the first direct assault came from a fleet that bore the colors of the World Eaters. The ships that emerged from a fold in space-time were twisted parodies of Imperial vessels, their hulls adorned with brass and blood, while demon engines that screamed with eternal rage powered weapons that fired projectiles of crystallized fury. But it was their leader that made even the clone's enhanced heart skip a beat. The figure that materialized on the main display during their hail was unmistakably a Primarch, but one that had been transformed by millennia of Khorne's influence into something that only barely remembered its humanity. Angron the Red Angel had become a creature of pure rage, his features twisted into a permanent expression of battle fury, while wings of shadow and brass spread from his shoulders like accusations against the Emperor who had failed to save him. "Brother!" The demon Primarch spoke, his voice carrying harmonics that made the ship's hull plates vibrate in resonance with his fury. "I smell the scent of loyalty on you, the stench of chains that you mistake for honor. You seek the Phoenician? You will find only disappointment and death in his palace of pleasures." The clone met his fallen brother's gaze without flinching, his own presence radiating the kind of controlled perfection that had always defined the Third Legion at its best. "I seek to end what should never have begun, Angron. The daemon wearing Fulgrim's face has committed crimes that stain the very fabric of reality. I will not allow them to continue." Angron's laughter was like the sound of breaking worlds. "End, there is no end, only eternal war. But if you would die for your precious ideals, then I will grant you that gift." The battle that followed was unlike anything in the clone's experience. The World Eater's vessels moved with the fury of their patron god, their attacks lacking tactical sophistication, but powered by such raw hatred that reality itself seemed to recoil from their presence. Their weapons fired shells that exploded into demon stuff upon impact, while their boarding craft were filled with Khorne berserkers who had long since forgotten any purpose beyond endless slaughter. But the clone's forces fought with the precision that had always been the Emperor's children's greatest strength. His ships moved in perfect formation, creating overlapping fields of fire that turned the World Eater's rage against itself. When the enemy attempted boarding actions, they found themselves facing purist marines who fought with a discipline that had been refined across 10 millennia of exile. The climax of the battle came when Angron himself led a boarding assault against the Perfection's edge, his demonic form tearing through bulkheads like tissue paper as he sought to confront his brother in single combat. The clone met him in the ship's primary hangar bay, Puritas Ascendant, singing with golden light as it clashed against Angron's demon weapons. The duel was brief, but apocalyptic. Two Primarchs at the peak of their abilities, one transformed by chaos into a creature of pure destruction, the other refined by purity into an ideal of controlled perfection. Sparks flew from their clashing weapons in patterns that briefly opened holes in local reality, while their movements were so fast that lesser beings would have seen only blurs of violence. In the end, it was not superior skill that decided the contest, but fundamental philosophy. Angron fought with the fury of the eternally damned, his every blow powered by 10,000 years of rage at injustices that could never be corrected. The clone fought with the certainty of one who had found his purpose, each strike calculated not just to destroy, but to preserve what was worth protecting. When Puritas Ascendant finally found its mark, carving a wound across Angron's chest that wept liquid fire and demon ichor, the Red Angel's form began to discorporate as his connection to the material plane was severed. "This is not possible," Angron gasped, his massive frame already beginning to fade as his essence was drawn back into the warp. "I am eternal, I am—" "You are my brother," the clone replied, his voice gentle despite the violence that had just transpired. "And somewhere beneath all that rage and corruption, you remember what it felt like to fight for something greater than yourself. When this is over, when the galaxy is cleansed of the demons that have claimed our family, perhaps we can speak again as we once did." As Angron's form vanished entirely, taking with it the World Eater's fleet that had been sustained by his presence, the clone's forces pressed deeper into the Eye's hellish embrace. But the encounter had cost them. 3 ships lost to demon fire, their crews consumed by entities that fed on courage itself. The Eldar reported that their spirit stones were beginning to crack under the psychic pressure, while even the purists showed signs of strain as the Eye's influence pressed against their mental defenses. The next challenge came in the form of space itself. As they navigated deeper into the storm's heart, the fleet found itself traveling through regions where the normal rules of 3-dimensional movement no longer applied. Corridors of twisted space-time led through the interiors of demon worlds, while stellar phenomena that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously created navigation hazards that defied conventional understanding. It was during passage through one such impossible region, a nebula that existed inside out and sang lullabies in the voices of murdered children, that they encountered the Slaneshi daemon worlds. These were not planets in any conventional sense, but rather manifestations of the Dark Prince's will, given physical form in the Eye's reality-warping embrace. Worlds of living flesh that pulsed with obscene vitality, their surfaces crawling with entities that had once been human, but had been transformed into instruments of sensation and suffering. Cities built from crystallized screams reached toward skies that wept tears of liquid pleasure, while armies of demon-touched creatures performed rituals too obscene to document. "We could go around," suggested Admiral Quarren, her weathered features pale as she studied the tactical displays showing the demon world's positions. "It would add weeks to our journey, but we could avoid direct confrontation with these abominations." The clone shook his head, his violet eyes fixed on the sensor readings that showed massive energy signatures emanating from the central demon world. "No. These worlds are not random obstacles. They're part of the demon Fulgrim's design. Each one is a component in his final symphony, a note in the composition that he's been crafting for decades. If we're going to stop the ritual, we need to understand its scope." The assault on the first demon world was a masterpiece of coordinated warfare that demonstrated everything the clone had learned about leadership and tactics during his short but intense existence. His forces struck not with the blind fury that chaos expected from Imperial forces, but with the surgical precision that had always defined the Emperor's children at their best. Thunderhawk gunships carried strike teams to specific targets, while orbital bombardments created corridors of advance through the daemon armies. The purists fought with a discipline that turned each engagement into a lesson in proper warfare, their bolter fire and blade work demonstrating the difference between controlled violence and mindless slaughter. But it was on the world's surface, that the clone experienced his most significant revelation. In the central temple, a structure built from the fossilized remains of an entire human population, he found evidence of the demon Fulgrim's recent presence. Murals painted in substances that should not have existed depicted scenes from across the galaxy, showing worlds burning while their population's suffering was channeled into a growing network of psychic energy. "It's a map," Inquisitor Castellan realized as she studied the nightmare artwork with her augmetic eye. "Every world the demon has corrupted, every population center he's transformed, they're all connected by ley lines of psychic energy that converge on a single point." The convergence point, according to the murals, was a palace that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, a structure that had been under construction for centuries, built from the suffering of countless billions and anchored to reality by atrocities that defied comprehension. As they prepared to depart the purged demon world, carrying with them intelligence that would guide them toward their final destination, the clone received a vision that made his enhanced physiology go cold with recognition. The demon Fulgrim appeared to him not through conventional communication, but through a direct psychic assault that bypassed every defense his fleet possessed. The creature that wore his face stood in a throne room, built from living music, his perfect features marred by an expression of cruel anticipation. "My pale shadow," the demon purred, his voice carrying harmonics that spoke directly to the soul. "You have impressed me with your determination, your tactical skill, your absolute commitment to this hopeless cause. Soon you will see the palace I have built, experience the symphony I have composed, and understand the futility of everything you believe." The vision showed glimpses of the palace itself, a structure that hurt to perceive directly, built according to geometries that existed in 11 dimensions simultaneously. At its heart was a chamber where reality itself had been twisted into the shape of a massive pipe organ, its keys made from the crystallized screams of worlds, while its pipes channeled the psychic energy of entire sectors. "The final symphony awaits only one more instrument," the demon continued, his image beginning to fade as the vision ended. "When you arrive, and you will arrive, for I have seen all the paths fate might take, you will complete the composition that will transform not just this galaxy, but all realities that touch upon it. Your purity will be the final note that gives meaning to all the corruption that came before." As the vision ended, and the clone's consciousness returned fully to his own body, he found his command crew staring at him with expressions of concern and determination. They had all felt the psychic assault, shared in the revelation of their enemy's true plan. "He's not just trying to corrupt the galaxy," the clone said quietly, his voice carrying across the bridge with the weight of absolute certainty. "He's trying to transform the very nature of existence itself, to create a reality where suffering and pleasure are indistinguishable, where corruption is elevated to the level of universal law." Standing before the main viewport, as his battered fleet prepared for the final leg of their journey, the clone watched distant stars die and be reborn in the span of heartbeats, while demon things that had once been Imperial citizens danced through the void in patterns that spoke of madness given form. They had lost much during their passage through the Eye: ships, allies, and pieces of their own souls that even Primarch physiology could not fully protect. But they had gained something as well: absolute knowledge of what they faced, and unwavering certainty that failure was not an option. Ahead lay the demon Fulgrim's palace, the heart of a corruption that threatened to consume all realities. Behind lay a trail of purged demon worlds and defeated enemies, proof that even in the eye of terror, purity could triumph over corruption. The hunt was almost over. Soon would come the reckoning. Chapter 11. The Palace of Excess. The Palace of Excess defied every law of architecture, physics, and sanity that the clone had ever known. It existed in 11 dimensions simultaneously, its spires reaching through realities that had no names, while its foundations were anchored in the crystallized screams of entire civilizations. As his fleet approached the impossible structure through the warp's writhing chaos, the clone felt his enhanced senses recoil from stimuli that threatened to overwhelm even a Primarch's capacity for comprehension. "By the throne," whispered Captain Valerius, his scarred features pale as he studied the tactical displays that struggled to render the palace's true form. It's beautiful." And it was. That was perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the demon Fulgrim's creation. Despite being built from suffering and anchored by atrocity, the palace possessed an aesthetic perfection that spoke to something fundamental in the human soul. Its walls were composed of living music that had been given physical form, while its windows opened onto vistas of pure sensation that promised experiences beyond mortal comprehension. The clone forced himself to look away from the palace's hypnotic beauty, focusing instead on the tactical realities of their assault. "All vessels, maintain defensive formation," he commanded. "Do not look directly at the structure's artistic elements. What we're seeing is designed to seduce as much as to intimidate." Inquisitor Castellan, her augmetic eye sparking as it attempted to process visual data that contradicted itself moment by moment, shared the intelligence her savants had gathered during their approach. The palace is defended by approximately 10,000 Chaos Space Marines, plus demon support and cultist auxiliary forces. But the real challenge will be navigating the interior. Our scans suggest that space inside the structure folds back on itself in ways that make conventional movement impossible. Farseer Ivrain, her ancient features drawn with the strain of maintaining psychic shields in the heart of Chaos territory, added her own warnings. Worse than that, the palace itself is alive, conscious, responding to our thoughts and intentions. Every step we take will be observed. Every decision we make will be anticipated. Your demon twin has had decades to prepare for this confrontation. The first line of defense came in the form of a fleet that bore the colors of the Emperor's children, but not as they had appeared during the Great Crusade. These vessels were twisted parodies of their former glory, their hulls adorned with modifications that transformed them into instruments of sensation and suffering. Sonic weapons that could shatter souls as well as matter. Neural disruptors that turned pain into pleasure and pleasure into agony. Plasma cannons that fired streams of liquid ecstasy capable of driving entire crews mad with a single hit. Leading the defense was a ship that the clone recognized from the fragmentary records he had absorbed during his awakening, the pride of the Emperor, Fulgrim's own flagship during the heresy, now transformed into a monument to everything the Third Legion had become. Its captain, broadcasting on all frequencies, was a voice from the clone's inherited nightmares. "Welcome, Pale Shadow," came the transmission, and the clone felt his enhanced physiology go cold with recognition. Lucius the Eternal, the faultless blade, Slanish's chosen champion among the Emperor's children. His image appeared on the main display, a figure that had once been beautiful, but was now a patchwork of scars and modifications, each wound telling the story of a warrior who had killed him, each scar a trophy of victory stolen from death itself. "I have been waiting for this moment," Lucius continued, his voice carrying harmonics that spoke of 10,000 years spent perfecting the art of causing suffering. "To face the perfect copy of our fallen gene father, to demonstrate why corruption will always triumph over purity, why pleasure will always overcome duty." The battle that followed was unlike anything in the clone's experience. Where previous engagements had been decided by tactical superiority and strategic thinking, this was a contest of fundamental philosophies made manifest through violence. Lucius commanded his forces with the same skill he had once displayed as a loyalist, but twisted through the lens of 10 millennia spent in service to the Dark Prince. The corrupted Emperor's children fought with a precision that matched their pure counterparts, but their every movement was an expression of the perverse artistry they had embraced. Their weapons' fire created patterns in space that were as beautiful as they were deadly, while their tactics demonstrated a mastery of warfare that had been refined through centuries of inflicting and receiving pain. But the clones' forces possessed something their enemies had long forgotten: unity of purpose. Where the Chaos Marines fought for personal glory and the promise of sensation, the purists and their Imperial allies fought for something greater than themselves. They moved as one organism, each ship and warrior contributing to a larger symphony of righteous purpose that gradually overwhelmed the enemy's individual excellence. The climax of the space battle came when the clone led a boarding assault against the pride of the Emperor itself, his Thunderhawk cutting through defensive fire that would have annihilated any conventional aircraft. As he and his warriors breached the flagship's hull, they found themselves in corridors that had been transformed into living artworks, walls that pulsed with veins carrying fluids that should not have existed, floors that were warm to the touch and yielded like flesh beneath their feet. It was in the ship's command center that the clone faced Lucius in single combat, and the encounter nearly shattered his faith in everything he believed. Lucius had become something beyond a mere Chaos Space Marine. His body was a canvas displaying every wound he had ever received, each scar a work of art that told the story of a warrior who had died fighting him. His blade, the lash of torment, sang with the voices of every soul it had claimed, while his movements were a perfect fusion of martial skill and aesthetic expression. "You cannot defeat me," Lucius said, as their weapons clashed in the center of the command bridge. "I am eternal, sustained by the Prince of Pleasure's gifts. Every warrior who strikes me down becomes me, their consciousness added to my collection. What will happen, I wonder, when I claim the soul of a Primarch?" The duel that followed pushed both warriors to their absolute limits. Lucius fought with the skill of 10,000 years spent in constant combat, his blade work a masterpiece of technique that turned violence into art. But the clone fought with something more. He carried within him not just skill, but purpose, not just strength, but the accumulated righteousness of all who had stood against corruption. When Puritas Ascendant finally found its mark, piercing through Lucius's defenses to carve a wound across his chest, something unprecedented happened. Instead of the usual transformation that occurred when Lucius was defeated, the demon's hold on him seemed to waver, as if the clone's purity was too much for Slanesh's curse to overcome. "Impossible," Lucius gasped, looking down at a wound that was not healing, that was not transforming his killer into himself. "The prince's gift, my immortality." "Your curse," the clone corrected, his voice gentle despite the violence that had just transpired. "You were once Lucius the Faultless, one of the finest swordsmen the 3rd Legion ever produced. That man is still there, somewhere beneath all the scars and modifications. Perhaps there is still hope for redemption." But before Lucius could respond, his form began to fade as the flagship's destruction pulled his essence back into the warp. The clone watched him disappear with something approaching sadness. Another brother lost to corruption, another soul that might have been saved under different circumstances. With the outer defenses breached, the clone's forces pressed their assault directly against the Palace of Excess itself. The structure's defenses were unlike anything they had encountered. Walls that screamed warnings in the voices of those who had built them. Weapons that fired ammunition made from crystallized emotions. Defenders who fought with techniques that had been learned in dimensions where pain and pleasure were indistinguishable. But most challenging of all was the palace's interior architecture. Rooms existed in multiple states simultaneously. Corridors led to destinations that changed based on the observer's expectations, and stairways ascended and descended at the same time, depending on which direction one chose to perceive them. The clone found himself relying not on conventional navigation, but on an intuitive understanding of his enemy's mind, following paths that led toward whatever the demon Fulgrim most wanted to protect. That path led, inevitably, to the Gallery of Souls. The chamber was vast beyond comprehension, its walls lined with paintings, sculptures, and other artworks that were revealed upon closer inspection to be living beings, humans, Xenos, and even space marines who had been transformed into aesthetic objects for the daemon's amusement. They were not dead, but existed in a state somewhere between life and art, conscious and aware, but unable to move or speak except when their tormentor chose to grant them that gift. At the gallery's heart was the masterpiece, a painting of extraordinary beauty that depicted a woman whose features seemed to change depending on the angle from which it was viewed. The clone recognized her from the fragmented memories he had inherited. Serena D'Angelis, the remembrancer whose portrait had become the focal point of his original's obsession with perfection. But it was not the painting itself that caught the clone's attention. It was what lay trapped within its painted layers. Using senses that existed beyond the merely physical, the clone could perceive the consciousness that had been bound within the artwork's substance. It was a soul that burned with frustrated fury, a mind that retained perfect clarity despite millennia of imprisonment. And as he reached out with his psychic abilities, tentatively touching the edges of that trapped awareness, he felt a familiar presence respond. "Brother," came a voice that spoke directly into his mind, carrying with it the weight of 10,000 years of rage and regret. At last, someone comes who might understand the magnitude of what has been done. The original Fulgrim's consciousness, somehow preserved within the painting, despite the daemon's domination of his physical form, reached out to the clone with desperate hope. Through their psychic connection, images flooded between them. Memories of the moment when the demon had first taken control, visions of the atrocities that had been committed in his name, and most importantly, knowledge of the final symphony's true purpose. "It is not enough to simply possess my body," the original Fulgrim explained, his mental voice crackling with barely contained fury. "The demon seeks to merge our essences completely, to create something that is neither wholly chaos nor wholly human, but a perfect fusion of both. The final symphony is the ritual that will complete this fusion, using my soul as the final ingredient in a transformation that will make the demon invincible." The clone absorbed this information while simultaneously coordinating his forces' advance through the palace's impossible architecture. Around them, the building itself was beginning to respond to his presence, walls shifting to create new passages, while ceilings opened to reveal chambers that existed in pocket dimensions, accessed through doorways made of crystallized time. "There is something else," the original Fulgrim continued, his consciousness pressing closer to the clone's own awareness. "The demon has been collecting souls not just for the pleasure of possession, but to use as components in the ritual itself. Every being trapped in this gallery will become a note in the final symphony, their suffering transformed into the psychic energy needed to complete the transformation." Looking around the Gallery of Souls with this new understanding, the clone realized the true scope of his enemy's plan. There were thousands of trapped consciousnesses here. Humans, Eldar, even other space marines who had been captured and preserved for this purpose. Each one would become fuel for a ritual that could potentially reshape the galaxy itself. "Can the demon be separated from your body without destroying your soul?" the clone asked, though he feared he already knew the answer. The original Fulgrim's response carried the weight of millennia spent contemplating this very question. "After so long, our essences have become intertwined in ways that may be impossible to undo. But there might be a way, if you are willing to make the ultimate sacrifice." Before the clone could ask what that sacrifice might entail, alarms began sounding throughout the palace as the demon Fulgrim finally deigned to acknowledge his presence directly. The Gallery of Souls began to shift and change, its walls flowing like liquid as passages opened that led toward the palace's ultimate chamber, the concert hall where the final symphony would be performed. Standing at the gallery's far end, having appeared as if conjured from the clone's own nightmares, was the demon that wore his face. It was beautiful and terrible in equal measure, its perfect features unmarked by the corruption that permeated its soul. When it spoke, its voice carried harmonics that made reality itself sing in response. "My pale reflection," it said, spreading arms that encompassed not just the gallery, but the entire palace beyond. "Welcome to the culmination of 10,000 years of artistic endeavor. Soon you will understand why everything that has happened, every atrocity, every corruption, every moment of suffering, was necessary to create something truly perfect." The clone drew Puritas Ascendant, its golden blade humming with righteous purpose as he prepared for the confrontation that would determine not just his own fate, but the survival of everything he had sworn to protect. Behind him, the trapped consciousness of the original Fulgrim whispered final words of warning and preparation. Ahead lay the concert hall, where the final symphony waited, and with it, a choice that would echo through eternity: redemption or damnation, purity or corruption, the salvation of a galaxy or its transformation into something that no longer remembered what it meant to be human. The final movement was about to begin. Chapter 12. 2 souls, 1 body. The concert hall existed at the nexus of 11 dimensions, its architecture a masterpiece of impossible engineering that made reality itself weep with envy. The chamber stretched infinitely in all directions, while simultaneously being intimate enough that every whispered word could be heard clearly from any point within its boundaries. At its heart stood a pipe organ of such magnificent horror that merely looking upon it threatened to shatter the observer's sanity. An instrument built from the crystallized screams of entire worlds, its keys carved from the bones of saints, its pipes channeling the psychic energy of 1 billion tortured souls. The demon Fulgrim stood before this monument to his artistry, his perfect form radiating an aura of terrible beauty that made even the clone's enhanced physiology recoil. He had shed all pretense of mortality, revealing the true extent of what 10,000 years in service to Slaanesh had wrought. His flesh was like living marble, unmarked by any flaw, yet somehow conveying an impression of corruption so profound that it existed beyond the merely physical. When he moved, reality bent around him like a gravitational field, and when he spoke, the very foundations of existence trembled in response. "Behold," the demon said, gesturing to the impossible organ with movements that were poetry given form. "The culmination of 10 millennia of artistic endeavor. Each key represents a world I have elevated through corruption. Each pipe channels the suffering I have refined into something approaching beauty, and you, my pale reflection, will provide the final note that transforms this composition from mere music into universal law." The clone drew Puritas Ascendant, its golden blade casting light that seemed to push back the concert hall's oppressive atmosphere. "I will provide nothing but your end," he replied, his voice carrying the absolute authority of a Primarch who had found his true purpose. "The suffering you have caused, the innocence you have tormented, the legacy you have perverted, all of it ends here." The demon's laughter was like crystal bells chiming in harmony with distant screams. "End? There are no endings in service to the Prince of Pleasure, only eternal crescendos building toward ever greater heights of sensation. But if you insist on playing your part through violence rather than willing submission, then let us compose a symphony of war that will echo through every reality." What followed was not merely a battle, but a fundamental conflict between opposing philosophies made manifest through violence. The daemon Fulgrim fought with weapons that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, blades that cut through time as well as space, whips that struck at memory and emotion rather than flesh, projectiles of pure sensation that could drive mortals mad with a single touch. But the clone met each attack with Puritas Ascendant, the reforged blade singing with harmonies that spoke of duty fulfilled and honor restored. Where the demon's weapons sought to corrupt and pervert, the clone's sword purified and cleansed. Where his enemy's movements expressed the dark artistry of 10,000 years spent in service to excess, the clone's combat style embodied the disciplined perfection that the Emperor's children had represented before their fall. As their weapons clashed in the center of the concert hall, sparks flew from the impact points in patterns that briefly opened windows into other realities, glimpses of worlds where the heresy had never happened, timelines where Fulgrim had remained loyal, futures where the galaxy had been purged of chaos entirely. Each strike created ripples that spread outward through the palace's impossible architecture, causing the very walls to sing with harmonics that had never been heard before. "You feel it, don't you?" the daemon taunted, as his blade carved a shallow wound across the clone's shoulder, drawing blood that sparkled with inner light. "The futility of your cause, the impossibility of your mission. I am not some external corruption that can be cut away. I am woven into every fiber of this body, integrated into every thought and memory. To destroy me is to destroy the very soul you seek to save." The clone pressed his attack, his movements becoming faster and more precise as he drew upon reserves of skill and determination that he had not known he possessed. "Then I will find another way," he declared, Puritas Ascendant's edge finding gaps in the daemon's guard to leave wounds that wept liquid starlight. There is always another way for those with the will to seek it. It was during one such exchange, as the two combatants locked blades in a contest of pure strength, that the clone felt something unexpected, a familiar presence pressing against the edges of his consciousness. Through their physical contact, the psychic barriers that had kept the original Fulgrim's soul imprisoned began to weaken, allowing direct communication between the brothers for the first time in millennia. "Now," came the original's voice, crackling with barely contained fury and desperate hope. "While our essences are in contact, there may be a chance, but the cost." Through their shared connection, the clone suddenly understood the true complexity of what they faced. The daemon had not simply possessed Fulgrim's body, it had woven itself through his very soul, creating a tapestry of corruption and purity so intricate that separating the two seemed impossible. But there was one way, one path that might allow salvation at a price that would test even a Primarch's resolve. "You would have to sacrifice yourself," the clone whispered, his words carrying across their psychic link, even as he continued to fight the demon's physical form. "Pour your entire essence into my body, leaving nothing behind to sustain the corruption." "Yes," the original Fulgrim replied, his mental voice heavy with 10,000 years of accumulated guilt and regret. "I would cease to exist as an individual consciousness, becoming instead a part of your own soul. You would carry my memories, my experiences, my failures, but also my redemption. You would become not just a copy of what I was, but the fulfillment of what I was always meant to be." The implications were staggering. The clone would cease to be merely a genetic duplicate and become something entirely new, a fusion of two souls that retained the best of both while leaving behind the worst. But it would mean the death of the original Fulgrim, not just as a physical being but as a distinct consciousness. "There has to be another way," the clone protested, even as he drove Puritas Ascendant toward the daemon's heart, only to have the blow deflected by supernatural reflexes. "There is no other way," the original replied with the certainty of one who had spent millennia contemplating this very scenario. But this is not death. This is transformation, transcendence, the final step in becoming what the Emperor always intended his sons to be. Through you, I will live on. Through you, the Third Legion can be redeemed. As if sensing the psychic communion between them, the demon Fulgrim's attacks became more frenzied, more desperate. "What are you planning?" it shrieked, its perfect features twisting into an expression of fury and fear. "I feel something changing, something that should not be possible." The clone made his decision with the same instant certainty that had guided all his actions since awakening in Bile's laboratory. Stepping back from combat, he raised Puritas Ascendant not in an attack position, but as a conduit, its blade beginning to glow with energies that existed beyond the merely physical. "I understand now," he said, his voice carrying across the concert hall with absolute conviction. This was always the plan, not to save Fulgrim, but to become him, to take up the burden he could no longer bear and carry it forward into a future where the Third Legion's honor might finally be restored. The ritual that followed was like nothing recorded in Imperial or Chaos lore. Using Puritas Ascendant as a focus, the clone opened his soul completely, allowing the original Fulgrim's consciousness to flow into his own being, while simultaneously using his own purity as a weapon against the demon that had held his brother captive for so long. The process was agony beyond description. The clone felt his individual identity dissolving as the original's memories, experiences, and emotions flooded into his consciousness. He experienced the joy of the Great Crusade as if he had lived it himself, felt the weight of command over a legion of warriors who looked to him as both father and exemplar. But he also absorbed the guilt and shame of the fall, the moment when the layer blade had whispered its first corrupting words, the gradual slide into excess and perversion, the horror of watching his sons transform from noble warriors into pleasure-seeking degenerates. Through it all, the demon fought desperately to maintain its hold, its form beginning to blur and distort as the psychic energies that had sustained it for 10 millennia were turned against it. "This is impossible!" it screamed, its voice no longer beautiful but raw and desperate. "I am eternal. I am perfection incarnate. I cannot be undone by mere purity." But purity, the clone realized, was not mere. It was the most powerful force in existence, capable of standing against any corruption when wielded with absolute conviction. As the original Fulgrim's essence completed its transfer, the demon's hold on the physical form finally snapped, its screaming consciousness cast back into the warp from whence it had come. What remained was something unprecedented, a body that bore Fulgrim's genetic template, but housed a consciousness that was both original and copy, individual and collective. The clone opened eyes that held 10,000 years of memory, but burned with the clarity of purpose that comes only from absolute certainty of one's mission. But the cost had been enormous. The physical form that had once housed both Primarch and Daemon was failing, its cellular structure unable to withstand the psychic trauma of the separation. As the newly unified consciousness struggled to maintain coherence, he felt the original Fulgrim's essence making one final sacrifice. "Take my strength," the dying original whispered through their shared awareness. "Take my knowledge, my experiences, my love for our sons and our duty. Become not what I was, but what I should have been. Lead them home." The transfer was gentle this time, a gift freely given rather than a battle to be won. The clone felt the original's memories settling into place within his consciousness, not as foreign experiences, but as parts of his own identity that had simply been temporarily forgotten. He remembered the Emperor's vision for the Third Legion, recalled the pride he had felt when his sons had first donned the purple and gold, experienced again the joy of creating works of art that elevated the human spirit rather than degrading it. As the original Fulgrim's consciousness faded into peaceful dissolution, the concert hall began to collapse around them. Without the demon's presence to sustain it, the palace's impossible architecture started to unravel, reality reasserting itself with violent force. The organ of tortured souls screamed one final note before shattering into fragments that dissolved into nothingness, releasing the trapped consciousnesses to whatever peace awaited them beyond death. The newly unified Fulgrim, no longer merely a clone, but the true inheritor of a Primarch's legacy, made his way through the collapsing palace toward his waiting forces. Behind him, the gallery of souls was already beginning to fade as the trapped artworks crumbled into dust, their subjects finally free from their aesthetic imprisonment. Captain Valerius met him at the extraction point, his scarred features showing relief and something approaching awe. "My lord?" The psychic emanations, the reports from our navigators. Something fundamental has changed. "Everything has changed," Fulgrim replied, his voice carrying harmonics that had not been heard since before the heresy. "The daemon is banished, the palace is destroyed, and the final symphony will never be performed. But more than that, the Third Legion has been given a second chance, an opportunity to reclaim the honor that was stolen from us 10,000 years ago." As their fleet departed the collapsing palace, leaving behind the wreckage of 10 millennia of corruption, Fulgrim stood on the bridge of the Perfection's Edge and contemplated the future. Through the viewports, he could see the Eye of Terror's chaotic energies beginning to stabilize, as the removal of the daemon's influence created ripple effects throughout the region. "Set course for Imperial space," he commanded, his enhanced senses already detecting the distant signals of the 13th Black Crusade's advance. "Our work here is complete, but our greater mission has only just begun. The galaxy burns while the forces of chaos advance unchecked. It is time for the Emperor's children to remember what we were created for, not to seek perfection for its own sake, but to defend perfection wherever it might be found." Inquisitor Castellan, her augmetic eye gleaming with something that might have been hope, moved to stand beside him. "The Imperium will struggle to accept you," she warned. "A returned Primarch, especially one bearing Fulgrim's genetic signature, will face suspicion and hostility from those who remember only the traitor rather than the hero he once was." Fulgrim nodded, his violet eyes reflecting the light of distant stars as they translated back into real space for the first time in subjective weeks. "Then we will prove ourselves through action rather than words. The Third Legion will earn its redemption, one world at a time, one battle at a time, until even our harshest critics are forced to acknowledge that we are no longer the Legion that fell to chaos." As they approached the edge of Imperial space, long-range Vox communications began filtering through the fleet's auger arrays, reports of worlds under siege, battle groups requesting reinforcement, entire sectors calling for aid as Abaddon's forces pressed their advantage. The galaxy was indeed burning, consumed by the greatest chaos incursion since the heresy itself. But for the first time in 10,000 years, the Emperor's children were going to war, not in service to their own desires, but in defense of those who could not defend themselves. Under the command of a Primarch who carried both the wisdom of experience and the purity of purpose, they would show the galaxy what true perfection looked like. Not the corrupt excess they had once embodied, but the disciplined excellence that the Emperor had always intended them to represent. The hunt was over, the redemption had begun, and somewhere in the distance, the Imperium's greatest trial awaited a legion that had finally found its way home. Standing in his command center, surrounded by warriors who had waited 10,000 years for this moment, Fulgrim began to plan the campaigns that would restore his son's honor and prove that even the most fallen could find redemption if they possessed the will to seek it. The Third Legion rode to war once more, but this time they would be the Emperor's children in truth as well as name.